After returning from Australia, Susan/Irshad made a deliberate decision not to limit her activism to Toronto. Instead, she broadened her campaign, traveling to and speaking in several Canadian cities. Her goal was to raise awareness about her experiences and to expose what she described as the abuses and dangers of the teachings of Islam, particularly regarding the treatment of women. She was determined to reach a wider audience and refused to be silenced by previous threats or opposition. The Islamic Religious Council in Toronto responded to Irshad's outspoken activism by taking legal action against her. They filed a lawsuit in an attempt to stop her public speeches and advocacy, likely viewing her criticism as a threat to their religious community and values. However, their efforts to use the legal system to silence her were unsuccessful, as the case was brought before a criminal court judge for review. The court denied the complaint brought by the Islamic Religious Council against Irshad because it was found to be in direct conflict with the principles of freedom of speech enshrined in Canadian secular law. The judge ruled that Irshad, as a resettled refugee and religiously persecuted woman, had the right to express her views and share her experiences publicly, even if those views were critical of Islam or its practices. This legal protection ensured that her voice could not be suppressed through the courts. When both legal action and threats failed to silence Irshad, her opponents escalated their efforts. Unable to stop her through the courts or intimidation, some individuals and groups began to plot her assassination. This marked a dangerous turn in the opposition she faced, as it moved from attempts at legal suppression to direct threats against her life. Irshad received numerous threats to her life. She was sent emails from a range of Islamic terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other jihadist groups. These emails explicitly threatened to kill her if she continued to speak out against what she described as the misogynistic teachings of the Prophet Muhammad and the terrorist tenets of Islam. The threats were intended to intimidate her into silence and to deter her from continuing her advocacy. Despite the severity and frequency of the threats, Irshad refused to be intimidated. She ignored the life-threatening emails and continued her campaign, speaking out even more forcefully against what she called the evils of the horrific Arab satanic cult that mistakenly calls Islam the religion of peace. Her resolve only seemed to strengthen in the face of danger, and she remained committed to exposing what she saw as systemic abuses. When it became clear that neither legal action nor threats could silence Irshad, her adversaries resorted to even more drastic measures. A secret deal was orchestrated between individuals in Saudi Arabia and a criminal gang in Canada. This collaboration aimed to eliminate Irshad, demonstrating the lengths to which her opponents were willing to go to stop her from speaking out. The plot underscored the seriousness of the opposition she faced and the international dimension of the threats against her. The Mad Cow Gang is described in the novel as a notorious criminal gang operating in Western Canada, specifically in the city of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Originally, the gang was formed by African immigrants from South Sudan and functioned like a typical criminal gang. However, over time, its leadership and membership changed, and it became far more dangerous and influential. How did the Mad Cow Gang's leadership fall into the hands of Muslim terrorists? Initial formation. The Mad Cow Gang started as a regular street gang, but as it grew, it attracted members from various backgrounds, including those with criminal records and those who had spent time in prison. Prison conversions. While in prison, some gang members converted to Islam. These conversions were not just personal spiritual decisions, but were influenced by other Muslim inmates, some of whom were already radicalized or had connections to terrorist groups. After their release, these converts became key leaders within the gang. Radicalization and terrorist influence. Once the leadership included these newly radicalized Muslim converts, the gang's activities and alliances shifted. The gang began to collaborate with international terrorist networks, including Somali terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab and wealthy Saudi sheikhs. This connection was solidified when Bilal Ahmed, formerly Nicholas Johnson, a former gang leader who converted to Islam in prison, traveled to Saudi Arabia, performed Hajj pilgrimage, and established direct contact with Saudi royals and terrorist operatives. Criminal terrorist nexus. The gang thus became a hybrid organization, blending traditional criminal activities like kidnapping, extortion, and violence with terrorist plots and international funding. The Mad Cow Gang's leadership, now composed of radicalized Muslim converts, was willing to carry out assassination and kidnapping plots on behalf of foreign sponsors, as seen in the plot against Ershad. Key points from the novel. The Mad Cow Gang's transformation was driven by the conversion of key members to Islam while in prison and their subsequent radicalization. Bilal Ahmed is the central figure who bridges the gang's criminal roots and its new terrorist connections. After his conversion and Hajj pilgrimage, he was recruited by Saudi sheikhs to orchestrate the kidnapping and planned assassination of Ershad. The gang's criminal terrorist alliance was further cemented by the promise of large sums of money from Saudi sponsors, who wanted Ershad silenced for her outspoken criticism of Islam. In summary, the Mad Cow Gang began as a local criminal group, but through the prison conversion and radicalization of its leaders, notably Bilal Ahmed, it became a tool for international terrorist interests. Its leadership fell into the hands of Muslim terrorists when these radicalized members took control, forged connections with foreign sponsors, and began executing plots that served both criminal and extremist agendas. The kidnap of Ershad in a Canadian city, Winnipeg, Manitoba, is described as a carefully orchestrated plot involving both local criminal elements and international actors. Here's how the kidnapping is planned and executed, according to the novel. 1. Motivation and background. The protagonist, known as Susan Peterson/Ershad Al-Shamari, becomes a high-profile target due to her outspoken criticism of Islam, her public speeches, and her activism for abused Muslim women. After her controversial speeches and activism, she receives threats from various Islamic terrorist groups and becomes a target for assassination and kidnapping plots, some of which are orchestrated with the involvement of wealthy Saudi sheikhs and a local Canadian gang. 2. The plot and key players. The Mad Cow Gang. The kidnapping is carried out by a notorious Canadian gang known as the Mad Cow Gang or Crazy Heifer Gang, which was initially formed by African immigrants from South Sudan, but later infiltrated and led by Muslim terrorists and converts to Islam. The main organizer is Bilal Ahmed, formerly Nicholas Johnson, a Canadian convert to Islam who became deeply religious while in prison and later performed Hajj pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia. He is recruited by Saudi sheikhs to orchestrate the kidnapping and assassination of Ershad. Saudi connection. The plot is financed by a Saudi sheikh, Prince Othman bin Zayden al-Tamimi al-Qurashi, and possibly other members of the Saudi royal family, who promised to pay $50 million for Ershad's assassination due to her criticism of Islam. 3. Execution of the kidnapping. Surveillance and planning. Bilal Ahmed and his gang monitor Ershad's movements. They learn about her schedule and the hotel where she is staying after a public speech in Winnipeg. Entry and abduction. 3 gangsters, including Bilal, enter the hotel armed and wearing masks, which hotel staff mistake for coronavirus masks. The hotel's security is minimal, and the only guard is unarmed. The gangsters kidnap Ershad at gunpoint, strip her of her clothes, and take her away before the police can intervene. Hiding the victim, Ershad is taken to a remote First Nation reservation in Manitoba, where she is imprisoned in a deep hole dug for her burial. The kidnappers plan to bury her alive after receiving payment from the Saudi financiers. What role did Bilal Ahmed play? Bilal Ahmed, formerly Nicholas Johnson, was a key figure in the kidnapping plot. He was a former gang member who converted to Islam while in prison and became deeply religious. After his release, he traveled to Saudi Arabia, performed Hajj rituals, and established connections with Saudi sheikhs who promised a large sum of money for Ershad's assassination. Bilal acted as the intermediary between the Saudi sponsors and the Mad Cow Gang, organizing the kidnapping, communicating with the sponsors, and handling the logistics of the ransom and payment. He was responsible for coordinating the operation and ensuring that the gang would only kill Ershad after receiving the promised funds. What was Bilal's background before prison? Before prison, Bilal Ahmed was known as Nicholas Johnson, a Canadian from a Catholic background. He was a member of the Mad Cow Gang and had a criminal record. While in prison, he converted to Islam, grew a beard, and became deeply religious, regularly praying and reading the Quran with fellow Muslim inmates. His religious behavior convinced the prison authorities that he had reformed, leading to his early release on parole. After his parole, he traveled to Saudi Arabia, performed Hajj rituals, and married a Somali woman. Upon returning to Canada, he became involved in the plot to kidnap and assassinate Irshad, motivated by the promise of a large financial reward from Saudi sponsors. Bilal Ahmed's connection to the Saudi sheikhs who hired him to plan the kidnap and assassination of Irshad is described in detail in the novel. Here's how the connection is established. Conversion and Hajj pilgrimage. Bilal Ahmed, originally Nicholas Johnson, was a Canadian from a Catholic background and a member of the Mad Cow Gang. While in prison, he converted to Islam and became deeply religious. After his release, he traveled to Saudi Arabia to perform the Hajj pilgrimage. During this trip, he became acquainted with influential people in the Muslim world. Meeting Somali terrorists and Saudi sheikhs while performing Hajj rituals, Bilal met members of a Somali terrorist group known as Al-Shabaab. These terrorists, upon learning that Bilal was from Canada, saw an opportunity and convinced him to plan the assassination of Irshad, who was considered a major enemy of Islam due to her outspoken criticism. The Somali terrorists introduced Bilal to a wealthy Saudi sheikh, Prince Othman bin Zayden al-Tamimi al-Qurashi, who claimed to be a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. This prince then connected Bilal with other sheikhs from the Saudi royal family. The deal and planning the Saudi sheikhs promised Bilal a large sum of money, eventually $50 million, if he could orchestrate and carry out the assassination of Irshad. The plan was for Bilal to organize the kidnapping and murder, and only after proof of her death would the money be paid. Bilal returned to Canada, recruited members of the Mad Cow Gang, and began coordinating the operation, acting as the intermediary between the Saudi sponsors and the Canadian gangsters. Financial arrangements. Bilal opened a bank account in Switzerland under his Somali wife's name to receive the funds from the Saudi sheikhs. However, the Saudi sponsors insisted that payment would only be made after the successful completion of the assassination, leading to a standoff between the gang and the sponsors until the Canadian police intervened. Summary table. Bilal Ahmed's connection to Saudi sheikhs. Step. Description. 1. Converts to Islam in prison, travels to Saudi Arabia for Hajj. 2. Meets Somali terrorists Al-Shabaab during Hajj. 3. Introduced to Saudi Sheikh Prince Othman bin Zayden al-Tamimi al-Qurashi. 4. Connected to other Saudi royal sheikhs who promise a reward for Irshad's assassination. 5. Returns to Canada, recruits Mad Cow Gang, coordinates kidnapping plot. 6. Opens Swiss bank account for payment, financial arrangements made contingent on proof of assassination. In essence, Bilal Ahmed's connection to the Saudi sheikhs is established through his conversion to Islam, his pilgrimage to Mecca, and his networking with Somali terrorists and Saudi royals during Hajj. This network enables him to become the central planner and intermediary for the plot to kidnap and assassinate Irshad, with the promise of a large financial reward from the Saudi sponsors. After his arrest, the police confronted him with evidence, including surveillance footage and email correspondence with the Saudi sheikhs. Initially, Bilal tried to deny his involvement, but when presented with the evidence, he revealed the entire plot, including the identities of his accomplices and the details of the kidnapping and assassination plan. His confession allowed the police to locate and rescue Irshad from captivity and to arrest the other gang members involved in the plot. Here's a step-by-step tracing of how Bilal Ahmed confesses the plot from A to Z in For the Sake of My Children. 1. Background: the kidnapping and investigation. Irshad is kidnapped in Winnipeg, Canada, by members of the Mad Cow Gang, orchestrated by Bilal Ahmed, formerly Nicholas Johnson. The Canadian police begin investigating the kidnapping. Surveillance footage shows Bilal entering the hotel with 2 other men on the day of the abduction. He initially denies involvement, claiming he was visiting a Somali relative of his wife, but the evidence contradicts his story. 2. Police surveillance and email evidence. After his initial release, Bilal is kept under surveillance by the RCMP. He sends an email from a public library to a contact in Saudi Arabia, discussing the ransom and the conditions for handing Irshad to him. The email mentions that the boys' gang members will not hand over the woman until their shares are deposited in the bank, and includes 2 Canadian bank account numbers. The police trace the email to Saudi Arabia and freeze the funds when $30 million is deposited into the accounts by Saudi sheikhs. 3. Arrest and confrontation. Once the money is deposited, the RCMP arrests Bilal Ahmed. At first, Bilal tries to deny his involvement in the kidnapping and the plot to kill Irshad. The police confront him with the surveillance footage, the email evidence, and the bank account information, making it clear they have a strong case against him. 4. Full confession. Under the weight of the evidence, Bilal confesses to the entire plot. He admits to orchestrating the kidnapping of Irshad with the help of 2 other Mad Cow Gang members. He explains how he was recruited by Saudi sheikhs during his Hajj pilgrimage, promised a large sum of money for the assassination, and how he coordinated the logistics of the abduction. He details the plan to hold Irshad for ransom, the negotiations with the Saudi financiers, and the intention to kill her once the money was received. Bilal also reveals the identities and roles of his accomplices, allowing the police to locate and arrest them and to rescue Irshad from captivity. 5. Outcome. Bilal's confession is crucial in unraveling the entire plot from A to Z. It leads to the rescue of Irshad, the arrest of the other gang members, and the exposure of the Saudi financiers' involvement. The confession also provides the court with the evidence needed to convict Bilal and his accomplices, who are sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Summary table. Bilal Ahmed's confession process. Step. Action/trigger. Result/impact. Surveillance. Police monitor Bilal after initial questioning. Gather evidence of email to Saudi Arabia. Email evidence. Bilal emails Saudi sheikhs about ransom. Police freeze bank accounts, confirm money transfer. Arrest. RCMP arrests Bilal after money is deposited. Bilal initially denies involvement. Confrontation. Police present evidence, video, emails, bank info. Bilal realizes denial is futile. Full confession. Bilal confesses to entire plot, names accomplices. Police rescue Irshad, arresting other gang members. Legal outcome. Confession used in court. Bilal and accomplices sentenced to life in prison. In summary, Bilal Ahmed's confession is triggered by overwhelming evidence, surveillance footage, email correspondence, and financial records. When confronted, he confesses to the entire kidnapping and assassination plot, details the involvement of the Saudi sheikhs, and helps police rescue Irshad and arrest his accomplices. His confession is pivotal in bringing the case to a successful resolution. Here are the direct quotes from Bilal Ahmed's confession. 1. Initial denial and confrontation. At first, he denied having visited the hotel that day. However, when confronted with the video, which showed very clearly at what time and on what day he was spotted entering the hotel with the other 2 men, Bilal claimed that he had completely forgotten about his visit to a Somali relative to his beloved Somali wife, Halima Al-Saadia, who was in the hotel that day. The police were able to verify Bilal's claim when a Somali man was staying at the hotel on the same day as the kidnapping. The police allowed him to go home but kept him under surveillance. 2. Surveillance and email evidence. Bilal's movements, contacts, telephone conversations, and email correspondence were carefully monitored by the RCMP after his interrogation and release. He sent an email from a public library to someone. Canadian police traced the recipient of this email to a computer in Saudi Arabia. In his letter, Bilal Ahmed informed the recipient that the boys are not ready to hand over the woman to him until he deposits their shares in the bank. The letter also included 2 bank accounts in Canada. The police identified the account holders as active members of the Mad Cow Gang. 3. Confession under interrogation. At first, the police were unable to find the other two men. Bilal tried to deny his involvement in the kidnapping, but when confronted with evidence, he spoke up and revealed the entire plot from A to Z. Through it, the police were able to locate these two criminals. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police has surprised the two gang members at the First Nation Reserve in Manitoba Province. In a small house, the police found the kidnapped Australian, Irshad Al-Shamari, imprisoned in a deep hole. 4. Details of the plot. Bilal tried to deny his involvement in the kidnapping, but when confronted with evidence, he spoke up and revealed the entire plot from A to Z. Through it, the police were able to locate these two criminals. 5. Revelation of Saudi connection and motive. Bilal Ahmed was unable to provide such a proof of the kidnap assassination of the abducted woman Irshad to the royal sheiks because his two other gangsters insisted that they would not kill their captured Australian victim until they were paid first. Moreover, they hid their captive woman in a deep hole on a remote Canadian First Nation reservation, thus keeping her out of the reach of their former gangmate Bilal Ahmed. Accordingly, Bilal tried to persuade the Saudi sheiks to pay the money first if they wanted him to convince the members of the Crazy Black Cow Gang to hand over the kidnapped Christian infidel woman and slaughter her with his knife as he slaughters a sheep. He promised that he would videotape the assassination of the damned woman and then send the video to the sheiks. For some time, neither side was willing to compromise on its condition. On the one hand, the gangsters demanded that the Arab princes must pay their wages first and then hand over the victim to their colleague Bilal, while the Saudi sheiks refused to pay until they had evidence of the murder of the abducted infidel woman. 6. Final outcome. When confronted with evidence, he spoke up and revealed the entire plot from A to Z. Through it, the police were able to locate these two criminals. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police has surprised the two gang members at the First Nation Reserve in Manitoba Province. In a small house, the police found the kidnapped Australian, Irshad Al-Shamari, imprisoned in a deep hole. When confronted with the evidence, Bilal spoke up and revealed the entire plot from A to Z, including the Saudi connection, the ransom, the gang's involvement, and the location of Irshad. His confession was pivotal in rescuing Irshad and arresting the other conspirators. When the police rescue Irshad from the members of the Mad Cow Gang in Canada, her physical and mental condition is described as extremely dire and traumatic. Physical condition. Naked and exposed, the kidnappers had stripped Irshad of all her clothes, including her underwear and bra, before throwing her completely naked into a deep hole they had prepared for her grave. She was about to be buried alive by her captors. Imprisoned in a pit, she was kept in a deep pit dug for her burial and final grave on a remote First Nation reservation in Manitoba. The conditions were harsh, cold, and terrifying, with no protection from the elements or from physical harm. Unharmed by rape, despite her beauty and vulnerability, the text notes that the kidnappers did not rape her, which is highlighted as unusual given the circumstances and the nature of her captors. Physical weakness. After days of captivity, nakedness, and exposure, Irshad was physically weakened, exhausted, and traumatized by the ordeal. Mental condition. Severe trauma. Irshad was deeply traumatized by the experience of being kidnapped at gunpoint, stripped naked, and thrown into a grave-like pit. The psychological terror of imminent death, humiliation, and isolation left her in a state of shock and despair. Terror and hopelessness. She was kept in the pit for days, fully aware that her captors planned to kill her once they received their payment. The anticipation of death and the helplessness of her situation caused intense psychological suffering. Humiliation. The act of being stripped and left naked in a hole was meant to degrade and dehumanize her, compounding her sense of vulnerability and shame. Resilience. Despite her ordeal, Irshad survived until the police arrived, showing a remarkable will to live even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Direct description from the novel. They had stripped her of all her clothes, even her underwear and bra, before throwing her completely naked into the hole they had prepared for her grave inside and burying her alive. Since the day she was kidnapped from the hotel, She has been imprisoned by her captors in a remote reservation for First Nation people, kept in the deep pit dug for her burial and final grave. Her kidnappers plan to bury her alive after they get their financial shares from the Saudis involved with them, who promise to pay them millions of dollars in exchange for killing the worst female enemy of Islam, the Australian, Irshad Al-Shamari. Summary table. Aspect. Description. Physical state. Naked, exposed, imprisoned in a deep pit, physically weakened, not raped but deeply humiliated. Mental state. Traumatized, terrified, hopeless, humiliated, but ultimately resilient. Circumstances. Imprisoned by gangsters, awaiting execution, rescued just before being killed. In summary, when police rescue Irshad, she is in a state of extreme physical vulnerability, naked, cold, and weak, and profound psychological trauma, having been stripped, humiliated, and left to die in a grave by her kidnappers. The experience leaves her deeply scarred, but ultimately alive, thanks to the timely intervention of law. Irshad was deeply relieved and grateful to be rescued alive. She was physically and emotionally exhausted, having been stripped naked, imprisoned in a pit, and facing imminent death. Despite her trauma, she survived without being raped or killed. The rescue reinforced her determination to continue her campaign against religious extremism and to use her story to advocate for women's rights and expose the dangers she had faced. The financial compensation she received as a result of the failed assassination plot further enabled her to support her activism and the Association of Abused Muslim Women. The public reaction to Irshad's rescue from the Mad Cow Gang in Canada is described as dramatic and highly polarized in the novel. 1. International and local media sensation. Breaking news. The rescue of Irshad is announced by the Winnipeg City Police as breaking news for the entire world. The media in Canada and internationally report that the Australian woman Irshad Al-Shamari has been found alive and unharmed after being kidnapped and nearly executed by a criminal gang with terrorist ties. Global attention. The story is picked up by major news outlets, and Irshad's ordeal becomes a global headline, highlighting both the dangers she faced and the international dimensions of the plot against her. 2. Public sentiment in non-Muslim countries. Relief and admiration. In non-Muslim countries, the news of Irshad's rescue is met with relief and admiration. Many people are horrified by the details of her kidnapping and the assassination plot, and there is widespread sympathy for her as a survivor of both religious persecution and violent crime. Horror and outrage. The public is shocked by the extent of the plot, the involvement of international actors, including Saudi financiers, and the brutality of her treatment. There is a sense of horror at the idea that such a plot could be carried out in Canada, and outrage at the targeting of a woman for her activism and speech. 3. Reaction in the Islamic world. Celebration and justification. In contrast, the Islamic world is described as rejoicing and celebrating in the streets at the news of Irshad's kidnapping and presumed assassination. She is labeled as the enemy of Islam and Muslims, and her disappearance is seen as a victory against someone who is viewed as a blasphemer and critic of Islam. Religious framing. The event is framed by some as a justified punishment for her outspoken criticism and activism against Islamic teachings. 4. Broader social commentary. Fear and debate. The incident sparks debate in Canada and other Western countries about the reach of international terrorism, the vulnerability of outspoken critics, and the need for better protection of free speech and human rights. Comparison to mafia. Many journalists and commentators compare the situation to a mafia, noting that Islam is like a mafia that no one can join, leave, or criticize without suffering physical annihilation. This reflects a sense of fear and the perception that criticism of Islam can lead to violent retribution, even in Western democracies. Direct quotes from the novel. It was breaking news for the entire world when the Winnipeg City Police announced that the Australian woman Irshad Al-Shamari had been rescued from her captors alive and unharmed by them. They did not even rape her despite her beauty and sexy naked body. They had stripped her of all her clothes, even her underwear and bra, before throwing her completely naked into the hole they had prepared for her grave inside and burying her alive. The Islamic world rejoiced and celebrated in the streets the news of the kidnapping and assassination of what they called the enemy of Islam and Muslims, the hateful Australian woman, Irshad Al-Shamari. However, non-Muslim countries greeted the news with sadness and horror. Many journalists have concluded that Islam is like a mafia that no one can join, leave, or criticize without suffering physical annihilation. Summary table. Region/group. Reaction. Non-Muslim countries. Relief, admiration, horror, and outrage at the plot and her treatment. Islamic world. Celebration, justification, and framing as a victory against a critic of Islam. Media/journalists. Sensational coverage, debate about free speech, terrorism, and the dangers of criticism. In summary, Irshad's rescue is met with relief and admiration in the West, horror at the brutality of the plot, and a sense of urgency about protecting free speech. In contrast, some in the Islamic world celebrate her presumed demise as a victory against an enemy of Islam. The event becomes a flashpoint for global debate about religious extremism, women's rights, and the risks faced by outspoken critics. The Islamic world rejoiced and celebrated in the streets the news of the kidnapping and assassination of what they called the enemy of Islam and Muslims, the hateful Australian woman, Irshad Al-Shamari. However, non-Muslim countries greeted the news with sadness and horror. Many journalists have concluded that Islam is like a mafia that no one can join, leave, or criticize without suffering physical annihilation. The final verdict of the Canadian Criminal Court on Bilal Ahmed and the other members of the Madhow gang is as follows. Bilal Ahmed, formerly Nicholas Johnson, a convert to Islam and the main organizer of the kidnapping plot, and the two other Madhow gang members were found guilty of kidnapping and attempting to assassinate Irshad Al-Shamari. All three were sentenced to life imprisonment in a maximum security prison in Canada without the opportunity for parole. This verdict was delivered after the police gathered sufficient evidence, including Bilal's confession and the tracing of financial transactions from Saudi sponsors. The court also ruled that the $30 million deposited by the Saudi sheikh into the gang members' accounts as payment for the planned assassination should be awarded as compensation to Irshad for the torture and physical violations she endured during her abduction and imprisonment. Summary table. Court's final verdict. Defendant. Crimes. Sentence. Additional ruling. Bilal Ahmed. Kidnapping, attempted assassination. Life imprisonment, no parole. $30 million compensation to Irshad. Madhow gang number 2. Kidnapping, attempted assassination. Life imprisonment, no parole. Madhow gang number 3. Kidnapping, attempted assassination. Life imprisonment, no parole. Key points. The verdict was praised as fair and just by the judge, who emphasized the severity of the crime and the suffering endured by Irshad. The financial compensation was seen as both restitution and a deterrent for future crimes of this nature. Here's a detailed account of the trial, the judge's statements, and the aftermath of the Madhow gang kidnapping case as described in For the Sake of My Children. The trial, setting, and proceedings. After Irshad was rescued from the Madhow gang, the Canadian Criminal Court in Winnipeg held a high-profile trial for Bilal Ahmed, formerly Nicholas Johnson, and the two other Madhow gang members. The trial was widely covered in the media due to the international dimension of the crime, the involvement of Saudi financiers, and the notoriety of the victim, Irshad, who had become a public figure for her outspoken criticism of Islamic extremism. Evidence presented. Bilal's confession. Bilal Ahmed, after being confronted with surveillance footage and evidence of the bank transactions, confessed to the entire plot, detailing how he was recruited by Saudi sheikhs during Hajj, how he recruited the Madhow gang, and how the ransom and assassination were to be carried out. His confession included the plan to videotape the assassination and the use of bank accounts to receive payment. Financial trail. The police traced the $30 million deposited by the Saudi sheikh into the gang's accounts, which was intended as payment for the assassination. The funds were frozen before they could be withdrawn. Physical evidence, surveillance footage from the hotel, email correspondence between Bilal and the Saudi sheikhs, and the physical condition in which Ershad was found, naked, imprisoned in a pit, about to be buried alive, were all presented as evidence. The judge's statements and reasoning. The judge's final verdict was severe and unequivocal. Life imprisonment. Bilal Ahmed and the 2 other Mad Cow Gang members were sentenced to life imprisonment in a maximum security prison in Canada without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized the seriousness of the crime, the international conspiracy, and the need for deterrence. Compensation to the victim. The judge ruled that the $30 million deposited by the Saudi sheikh into the gang's accounts should be awarded to Ershad as compensation for her ordeal. The judge stated that this money was compensation for the torture and physical violations that the Australian kidnapped victim, Ershad Al-Shamari, went through during her abduction and imprisonment in a deep hole in the reservation of the First Nation of the Indigenous inhabitants of Canada. Judge's reasoning, paraphrased from the text. The judge recognized the international dimension of the crime, the involvement of foreign financiers, and the severity of the plot. The life sentences reflected the seriousness of the crime, the danger posed by the gang, and the need for justice and deterrence. The judge explicitly stated that the money was not just a ransom, but compensation for the torture and physical violations Ershad suffered. Aftermath. Public reaction. International attention. The rescue and trial were breaking news in Canada and internationally. In the Islamic world, there was celebration at the news of her kidnapping and presumed assassination, as Ershad was seen as an enemy of Islam. In non-Muslim countries, the news was met with sadness and horror. Many journalists and commentators concluded that Islam was like a mafia that punishes those who leave or criticize it. Media coverage. The case was widely covered, and Ershad became a symbol of survival and resistance against religious extremism. Ershad's response. Relief and gratitude. Ershad was relieved and grateful to be rescued alive and unharmed. She was aware that she had narrowly escaped death, as the gang was about to kill her after receiving payment. Continued advocacy. The experience reinforced her determination to continue her campaign against the abuses she had suffered and witnessed, and she used the compensation awarded by the court to further her advocacy work. Legal and political impact. International tension. The investigation revealed the involvement of Saudi royal family members in the plot. The Saudi government denied official involvement, claiming the sheikh acted independently, but refused to extradite him to Canada for trial. This created diplomatic tension between Canada and Saudi Arabia. Criminal sentences. Bilal Ahmed and the 2 other Mad Cow Gang members were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The judge's decision to award the $30 million to Ershad was seen as a landmark ruling for victims of international terrorism and kidnapping. Direct quotes from the verdict and aftermath. The Canadian Criminal Court in Winnipeg ruled that the victim, Ershad Al-Shamari, must receive the $30 million that the rich Saudi sheikh deposited in the Bank of Montreal in exchange for her kidnapping and assassination. The judge of the Canadian Secular Court said, while issuing the fair verdict, that the money is compensation for the torture and physical violations that the Australian kidnapped victim, Ershad Al-Shamari, went through during her abduction and imprisonment in a deep hole in the reservation of the First Nation of the Indigenous inhabitants of Canada, who were known in the past as the Red Indians, by 2 members of the Mad Cow Gang and their partners in crime, the Muslim terrorist Bilal Ahmed, and the Saudi sheikh Othman bin Zayden al-Tamimi al-Qurashi. As for the 3 criminals, Bilal Ahmed and 2 of the Mad Cow Gang, they were sentenced to life imprisonment in a maximum security prison in Canada without the opportunity of parole for any of them. Ershad used the compensation she received after her rescue in several significant and purposeful ways, as described in the novel. 1. Supporting her family and children. Financial security for her children. After receiving large sums of compensation, including $30 million from the court as a result of the failed assassination plot, and earlier, $50 million for helping capture a terrorist, Ershad prioritized the well-being and future of her children and grandchildren. She opened bank accounts for them and deposited substantial amounts to ensure their education and care. Education. She enrolled her children and grandchildren in private Christian schools, paying for their tuition and safe transportation. She wanted to ensure they received a quality education and were raised in a safe, nurturing environment, far from the trauma and dangers they had previously experienced. 2. Rebuilding family life. Providing a home. With her wealth, Ershad bought a large mansion in Sydney, Australia, and moved her children and grandchildren there from her parents' home. She also officially changed their names from Islamic to Christian ones, symbolizing a new beginning and a break from their traumatic past. 3. Advocacy and activism. Founding the Association of Abused Muslim Women, Ershad used her resources to establish and fund an association for ex-Muslim women who had suffered abuse and oppression. She sponsored women who wanted to escape abusive environments and come to live in the West, and she encouraged others to share their testimonies, offering to publish them at her own expense. Publishing and public speaking. She spent lavishly on publishing her own books and the testimonies of other abused women, organizing meetings, and supporting branches of her association in other countries, such as the USA, where her friend Nadia started a branch. Her financial independence allowed her to travel, give speeches, and campaign for women's rights without fear of financial retaliation. 4. Personal healing and support for others. Charity and support. Ershad also used her compensation to help other women and children who had suffered similar abuse, providing them with financial aid, legal support, and opportunities for education and resettlement. 5. Summary table. Use of compensation. Details. Family support. Bank accounts, tuition, private schools, safe transport for children and grandchildren. Home and security. Purchased a mansion, provided a stable home for family. Advocacy and activism. Founded and funded the Association of Abused Muslim Women, published books, gave speeches. Support for other survivors. Sponsored escape, resettlement, and testimony publication for abused women. Personal healing. Focused on rebuilding family life and supporting others in similar situations. In summary, Ershad used her compensation not for personal luxury, but to rebuild her family, ensure her children's and grandchildren's future, empower other abused women, and become a leading advocate for women's rights and survivors of religious and domestic abuse. Her financial independence became a tool for healing, activism, and social change. After Ershad is rescued from the Mad Cow Gang in Canada, her life in Australia is marked by a dramatic transformation, both personally and publicly. Here's a detailed look at her activism, family life, and public speeches, based strictly on the content of For the Sake of My Children. 1. Family life after rescue. Return to family. After her rescue, Ershad, now Susan again, moves from her poor Muslim locality to her wealthy Christian parents' house in Sydney at their request. Her parents, Frank and Mary Peterson, welcome her back with open arms, forgiving her for her past choices and supporting her emotionally and financially. They help her secure a job in her father's import-export company, and she quickly regains a sense of belonging and stability within her family. Rebuilding bonds. The reunion is deeply emotional, especially after years of estrangement and trauma. Susan's parents are overjoyed to see her return to Christianity, and she feels restored as their favorite daughter. Her relationship with her eldest son, from her first relationship, is more complicated as he feels little attachment due to their long separation, but Susan works to rebuild trust and connection. Supporting her children and grandchildren. Susan uses her financial compensation from the Canadian court and other sources to support her children and grandchildren. She opens bank accounts for them, enrolls them in private Christian schools, and ensures they have a safe, nurturing environment. She also buys a large mansion in Sydney to provide a stable home for her family. 2. Activism and advocacy. Founding the Association of Abused Muslim Women, Susan channels her trauma into activism by founding an association for ex-Muslim women who have suffered abuse and oppression. She sponsors women who want to escape abusive environments and come to live in the West, and she encourages others to share their testimonies, offering to publish them at her own expense. Hundreds of ex-Muslim women join her association, sharing their stories of abuse as wives, sisters, and daughters in Muslim societies. Publishing and public speaking. Susan spends lavishly on publishing her own books and the testimonies of other abused women, organizing meetings, and supporting branches of her association in other countries, such as the USA, where her friend Nadia starts a branch. Her financial independence allows her to travel, give speeches, and campaign for women's rights without fear of Muslims' retaliation. Charity and support. She uses her compensation to help other women and children who have suffered similar abuse, providing them with financial aid, legal support, and opportunities for education and resettlement. 3. Public speeches and controversy. Fearless critique. Susan becomes a high-profile public speaker, giving controversial speeches in Australia, Canada, France, and elsewhere. Her speeches are direct, emotionally charged, and highly critical of the Quran and Hadiths, which she calls the main source of terrorism and the root of abuse and violence against women. She demands that these texts be banned in all Western countries, arguing that the problem of terrorism cannot be solved by military means alone, but must address the ideological sources. Personal testimony. In her speeches, Susan shares her own story of suffering, being beaten, raped, and subjected to humiliating sexual practices by her husband and witnessing her children's abuse. She describes the scars on her body and the trauma endured by her family as evidence of the systemic nature of the problem. Call to action. She urges Western societies to confront and expose the sources of misogyny and violence in religious texts, rather than hiding behind political correctness or fear of being accused of hate speech. She insists that the only way to defeat Islamic terrorism and protect women is to ban the texts that justify such acts. Rejection of Islamophobia accusations. Susan rejects the idea that her criticism is Islamophobic, arguing that fear and hatred of terrorist teachings and anti-woman practices are natural and should not be criminalized. She positions her activism as a moral duty to protect women and children. Controversy and backlash. Her speeches spark significant controversy. In Canada, she is banned from McMaster University and expelled by police after her speech is interpreted as a hate crime by Muslim students, immigrant feminists, and some professors. In France, her speeches lead to protests and accusations of lying and fabricating hadiths about the Prophet Muhammad. Despite the backlash, she continues her campaign, believing that her message is vital for the safety and dignity of women. 4. Personal healing and legacy. Healing and new beginnings. After her rescue and return to Australia, Susan focuses on healing herself and her family. She spends time with her children and grandchildren, supports their education, and helps them integrate into Australian society. Her parents play a crucial role in providing emotional and practical support, helping the family rebuild after years of trauma. Irshad's speech at the Sydney Public Crusade. Summary. 1. Fearless condemnation of Islamic texts. Irshad explicitly condemns the Quran and the Hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, calling them the main source of terrorism in the world and the root cause of abuse, oppression, and violence against Muslim women and female children. She demands that these Islamic religious texts be banned in all Western countries, arguing that the problem of terrorism cannot be solved by military means alone, but must address the ideological sources. 2. Critique of military solutions. She states that military action alone will never defeat terrorism, as groups like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS are true Muslims who cannot be eradicated by force. She explains that these groups are not conventional soldiers, but suicide bombers and invisible enemies who blend in with civilians and cannot be easily fought by traditional armies. 3. Personal testimony and evidence. Irshad shares her own story of suffering, being beaten, raped, and subjected to humiliating sexual practices by her husband and witnessing her children's abuse. She describes the scars on her body and the trauma endured by her family as evidence of the systemic nature of the problem, linking these abuses directly to religious justifications in Islamic texts. 4. Call to action. She urges Western societies to confront and expose the sources of misogyny and violence in religious texts, rather than hiding behind political correctness or fear of being accused of hate speech. She insists that the only way to defeat Islamic terrorism and protect women is to ban the texts that justify such acts. 5. Rejection of Islamophobia accusations. Irshad rejects the idea that her criticism is Islamophobic, arguing that fear and hatred of terrorist teachings and anti-woman practices are natural and should not be criminalized. She positions her activism as a moral duty to protect women and children. 6. Controversy and aftermath. Her speech is described as one of the most controversial ever delivered in Australia. She is shot by a domestic terrorist, a radicalized Muslim, as she leaves the podium, resulting in a coma and temporary loss of memory. The speech sparks outrage among Muslim leaders and communities, who accuse her of blasphemy and hate speech, while many in the non-Muslim public express admiration for her courage and support her call for reform. Key themes in the speech. Direct challenge to religious authority. Irshad does not hold back in her critique, using her personal suffering as a rallying point for broader social change. Advocacy for women's rights. She positions herself as a voice for abused women, calling for legislative and cultural change. Demand for secularization. She calls for the secularization of Muslim-majority countries and for Western societies to ban religious texts that, in her view, promote violence and misogyny. Personal risk. Her willingness to speak out, despite threats and violence, is highlighted as a testament to her courage and commitment. In summary, Irshad's speech at the Sydney Crusade is a searing indictment of the abuse of women under the interpretations of Islam, a critique of the religious texts that justify such practices, and a passionate call for reform and protection of women's rights. The speech is controversial, leading to both admiration and violent backlash, and cements her role as a fearless advocate for abused women. Muslim leaders responded to Irshad's speech at the public crusade in Sydney and to her broader activism, with intense outrage, condemnation, and calls for action against her. Here's a detailed summary of their response. 1. Outrage and accusations of blasphemy. Muslim religious leaders and imams in Australia were furious about Irshad's speech, which explicitly condemned the Quran and Hadiths as the root of terrorism and the abuse of women. They accused her of blasphemy, hate speech, and inciting hostility against Islam and its prophet Muhammad. Many leaders called for Muslims to boycott the public crusade event, likening it to the medieval Christian crusades against Muslims. 2. Public incitement and fatwas. Some Muslim leaders issued fatwas, religious rulings, declaring Irshad an apostate, someone who has left Islam, and stating that, according to Islamic law, she deserved to be killed for her apostasy and public criticism of Islam. These leaders incited their followers to view Irshad as an enemy of Islam and a legitimate target for retribution. 3. Community mobilization and threats. Muslim communities in Sydney and across Australia were mobilized by their leaders to protest against Irshad. There were calls for demonstrations and for Muslims to distance themselves from her and her message. Some Muslim men and women began to follow and spy on Irshad, spreading news of her apostasy and return to Christianity among the Muslim communities. She received direct threats to her life, and some Muslim terrorists threatened to kill her as an apostate Muslim woman. 4. Legal and social pressure. Muslim leaders and organizations attempted to use legal channels to silence Irshad, filing complaints and lawsuits against her for hate speech and incitement. However, these efforts were largely unsuccessful due to the protection of free speech under Australian law. The pressure extended to her family and social circles, with attempts to isolate her and undermine her credibility. 5. Justification of violence. The most extreme response was the attempted assassination of Irshad by a radicalized Muslim man who was influenced by the rhetoric and incitement of Muslim leaders. This act was seen by some in the Muslim community as justified punishment for her crimes against Islam. 6. International reaction. In the broader Islamic world, news of Irshad's activism and the attempt on her life was met with celebration and justification. She was labeled as an enemy of Islam, and her disappearance or presumed death was seen as a victory against blasphemy and criticism of the faith. Summary table. Muslim leaders' response. Aspect. Response. Religious condemnation. Accused Irshad of blasphemy and apostasy, issued fatwas calling for her death. Public incitement. Called for boycotts, protests, and social isolation. Legal/social pressure. Filed complaints and lawsuits, attempted to silence her through legal means. Threats and violence. Direct threats, surveillance, and ultimately an assassination attempt. International reaction. Celebration and justification of violence against her in some parts of the Muslim world. In summary, Muslim leaders responded to Irshad's speech with condemnation, incitement, and calls for her punishment, both through religious rulings and by encouraging social and, in some cases, violent action against her. Their response was rooted in the belief that her public criticism of Islamic texts and practices constituted blasphemy and apostasy, which, in their view, warranted severe consequences. Why some Muslims say the public crusade in Sydney reminds them of the Catholic Crusades in the 11th century. Historical parallels. Muslim leaders and community members drew a direct parallel between the Sydney Crusade and the medieval Catholic Crusades, which were military campaigns launched by European Christians to reclaim Jerusalem and other holy lands from Muslim rule. These crusades were marked by violence, religious conflict, and the killing of Muslims. Use of the term crusade. The use of the word crusade for the Christian event in Sydney was seen as provocative and reminiscent of the historical wars between Christians and Muslims. Muslim leaders argued that the event was not just a religious gathering, but a symbolic revival of the old Christian campaigns against Islam. Perceived attack on Islam. The content of Irshad's speech, explicitly condemning the Quran and Hadiths and calling for their ban, was interpreted as a modern-day attack on Islam, similar in spirit to the religious wars of the past. This perception fueled outrage and a sense of being under siege, reinforcing the historical memory of the Crusades as a time of existential threat to the Muslim world. In summary, Irshad's speech at the Sydney Crusade was a bold, controversial denunciation of Islamic texts and practices, calling for their ban in the West. Muslim leaders responded with condemnation, protests, and fatwas, seeing the event as a modern echo of the medieval Crusades, a symbolic and literal attack on Islam and its followers. Public speeches. A. Content and tone. Irshad's speeches were fearless, direct, and emotionally charged. She condemned the Quran and Hadiths as sources of terrorism and the root of abuse against women, calling for these texts to be banned in Western countries. She shared her personal experiences of abuse, rape, and humiliation, using her story as a rallying point for broader social change. Her speeches included calls to action, urging Western societies to confront the sources of misogyny and violence in religious texts and to prioritize the rights and safety of women over cultural or religious sensitivities. B. Sample excerpts from her speeches. Islam treats women like animals or something lower than dumb brutes. A woman is like a goat and a she-camel because everything is mounted. That means Allah created a woman like any female animal for the Muslim man to climb over her body and fuck her. All these female creatures, goat, she-camel, and woman, are made to climb on and have sex with by their male counterparts. This bad hadith shows us how Muhammad reduced the woman to a sexual being created by God for the man to climb her body and fuck her as a dog fucks its bitch. The only way to defeat Islamic terrorism is to expose its sources and causes and ban it globally. The unsurmountable problem of Islamic terrorism will not disappear from the contemporary world unless the two main texts of Islam, namely the Quran and the Hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, are banned. Irshad stated that the unbeatable problem of terrorism will not be solved by military fighting against the terrorists of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the Mujahideen of ISIS. If the American Marines and other NATO forces remain in Afghanistan for 100 years, they will not be able to defeat the Mujahideen of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, who are the true Muslims. See Impact and Controversy. Her speeches sparked outrage among Muslim communities, leading to protests, accusations of hate speech, and even assassination attempts. She was banned from speaking at some universities and faced ongoing threats, but she continued her campaign undeterred. 4. Security measures after the speech. After her high-profile speech, especially in the public crusade in Sydney, security was significantly increased. Sydney police provided protection for Irshad and other speakers, especially during large public events. Despite these measures, she was eventually targeted and shot at close range after one of her speeches, which led to a period of coma and memory loss. The shooter was later identified as a domestic terrorist with ties to a radical group. 5. Summary of the Public Crusade speech in Sydney. Irshad explicitly condemned the Quran and Hadiths as the main source of terrorism and the abuse of women, calling for their ban in Western countries. She argued that military action alone cannot defeat terrorism, as the ideology is perpetuated by religious doctrine. She described her own suffering and the suffering of other women as evidence of systemic abuse rooted in religious texts. She called for secularization of Muslim-majority countries and urged Western societies to confront the sources of misogyny and violence in religious texts. 6. Muslim leaders' response. Muslim leaders in Australia and elsewhere responded with outrage, calling for a boycott of the public crusade and likening it to the medieval Catholic crusades against Muslims. They accused Irshad of blasphemy, hate speech, and inciting violence against Muslims. Some issued fatwas calling for her death, and there were organized protests and public condemnation of her speeches. Why some Muslims compare the public crusade to the Catholic crusades? The term crusade evokes memories of the medieval Catholic crusades, 11th to 13th centuries, when Christian armies from Europe launched military campaigns to capture Jerusalem and other holy sites from Muslim control. For many Muslims, the word crusade is associated with religious war, violence, and the persecution of Muslims by Christian armies. Thus, a public Christian event labeled as a crusade is seen as a symbolic continuation of those historical conflicts. Summary of the Old Catholic Crusades, 11th century. The Catholic Crusades were a series of religious wars initiated by the Pope and European Christian monarchs, beginning in 1095 with the First Crusade. The main goal was to capture Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule and to secure safe passage for Christian pilgrims. Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, establishing several Christian states in the region. The Crusades continued for nearly 2 centuries, with varying degrees of success and failure. The Crusades were marked by intense violence, religious fervor, and atrocities committed by both sides. They had a lasting impact on Christian-Muslim relations and are remembered as a period of religious conflict and cultural exchange. After Irshad's, Susan Peterson's, speech at the Public Crusade in Sydney, several dramatic and life-altering events unfolded. 1. Immediate aftermath. Assassination attempt. As Irshad was coming down from the podium after delivering her controversial speech, where she explicitly condemned the Quran and Hadiths as the main source of terrorism and abuse against women, and called for their ban in Western countries, she was shot at close range in the back of her head. The bullet entered her skull, and she was immediately rushed to the hospital, where she remained in a coma for several days. 2. Medical consequences. After regaining consciousness, Irshad suffered from severe memory loss, amnesia. She could not recognize her own name, her parents, her children, or her grandchildren. All her loved ones became strangers to her. She underwent multiple treatments and brain surgeries over the next 3 years before she was able to fully regain her memory and recall the events of her past life. 3. Family and recovery. During her period of amnesia, Irshad, now Susan again, lived with her parents and children in Sydney. She enjoyed a peaceful family life, watching her children and grandchildren grow and thrive, but she could not remember her own history or activism. Her writings and speeches from before the attack continued to circulate and inspire others, even as she herself was unable to speak or write about Islam during this time. 4. Public and community response. The shooting was a national and international sensation. The police identified the shooter as a domestic terrorist, Professor Muhammad Yassin, a highly educated Australian Muslim with ties to radical groups. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The attack was widely condemned in non-Muslim communities, while some radical elements in the Muslim community celebrated it as a victory against an enemy of Islam. The event sparked intense debate about free speech, religious critique, and the risks faced by outspoken critics of religious extremism. 5. Long-term impact. After 3 years, Susan regained her memory through medical intervention. She resumed her activism, rebuilt her family life, and continued her campaign for women's rights and against religious extremism. She used her financial compensation and public platform to support abused women, publish testimonies, and advocate for change, both in Australia and internationally. In summary, Irshad's speech at the Sydney Crusade led to an assassination attempt that left her in a coma and with amnesia. After a long recovery, she returned to her activism and family, with her story and message continuing to resonate and inspire others even during her period of silence. How did she regain her memory? Irshad, Susan Peterson, regained her memory after a long and difficult period following the assassination attempt at the public crusade in Sydney, where she was shot in the back of the head. Here's how her recovery unfolded, based on the novel. 1. The shooting and memory loss. After delivering a controversial speech at a large open-air Christian crusade in Sydney, Irshad was shot at close range in the back of her head. The bullet entered her skull, and although it was removed in hospital, she remained in a coma for several days. When she regained consciousness, she suffered from severe amnesia. She could not recognize her own name, her parents, her 8 children, or her 3 grandchildren. Everyone around her was a stranger, and she had no memory of her past life, activism, or traumatic experiences. 2. The recovery process. Over the next 3 years, Irshad underwent extensive medical treatment and multiple brain surgeries in an American hospital in New York that specialized in neurological and brain surgery. During this time, her family and children tried to help her recover by sharing stories, showing her her own writings and speeches, and surrounding her with love and support. Despite this, her memory did not return immediately. 3. The turning point. The final breakthrough came after a particularly complex and lengthy brain surgery, which lasted 8 hours and was performed by 2 of the best American neurosurgeons specializing in brain and spinal cord surgery. This last operation was the final straw that brought back her memory. After the surgery, Irshad, now Susan again, was able to remember her past life as a persecuted and abused Muslim wife, her activism, her family, and her love for her American lover, the Good Samaritan guard from Guantanamo Bay. 4. After regaining memory. With her memory restored, Susan Peterson was able to reconnect with her family, resume her activism, and continue her campaign for women's rights and against religious extremism. She considered her survival and recovery a divine miracle and used her experiences to help other women and advocate for change. Here is a detailed summary of the life of the shooter of Irshad at the public crusade in Sydney, as depicted in the novel. Identity and background. Name: Professor Muhammad Yassin. Ethnic origin: Born in Australia to Arab immigrant parents originally from Egypt, the Arab Republic of Egypt, a Muslim-majority country. Citizenship: Australian by birth, never visited Egypt or any other Islamic country. Education: highly educated, in his final year of medical college at the University of Sydney. Occupation: teacher at Dar Al Huda School, a private Islamic school in Sydney, where he teaches Islamic courses and other academic subjects. Personal life: marital status, married with 7 children. Wives: 3 Muslim wives at the same time. First wife, Arab, originally from Lebanon, 4 children. Second wife, Somali, recently emigrated from a refugee camp in Nairobi, Kenya, 2 sons. Third wife, white Australian woman of British descent, 1 daughter. Only the third wife is officially registered. The other 2 are considered divorced by the Department of Social Work but are still visited by Yasin, who considers them his legitimate wives under Islamic law. Religious practice: deeply religious, performs all 5 daily prayers at the largest mosque in Sydney. Religious and social affiliations: group membership, active member of Al-Muhajirin Al-Muslimin, Muslim immigrants, a banned Islamic group in Australia, originated in the UK. Group activities: the group is known for its radical views, public condemnation of Western countries and India, and calls for jihad against infidel lands. Members practice polygamy, child marriage, and female genital mutilation, and follow strict Sharia law in their daily lives, often in defiance of Australian law. Community influence: the group runs Dar Al Huda School, where boys and girls are segregated and all staff are Muslims. The curriculum is heavily focused on Islamic texts, history of Muslims' conquests or invasions, and the glorification of jihad. Motivations and radicalization: religious zeal: Yasin is portrayed as a deeply committed Muslim, adhering strictly to the teachings of the Quran and Hadiths. He is described as a cultured, highly educated Muslim man, who is also a deeply religious man. Radical beliefs: he is an official teacher at Dar Al Huda School, which indoctrinates students with the necessity of jihad, the superiority of Muslims, and the inferiority of non-Muslims and women. He is influenced by the teachings of Al-Muhajirin, which advocates for the implementation of Sharia law and the rejection of Western values. The assassination attempt. Event: Irshad, the protagonist, is invited to deliver a keynote speech at a large open-air Christian crusade in Sydney, organized by all the Protestant churches of the city. Despite police warnings, she accepts and delivers a controversial speech condemning the Quran and Hadiths as the main sources of terrorism and abuse against women. Attack: as Irshad descends from the podium, Muhammad Yasin shoots her at close range in the back of the head. She is immediately taken to the hospital, where she survives, but falls into a coma and loses her memory for several years. Aftermath: Yasin is arrested by Sydney police, along with the leader and 4 other prominent members of Al-Muhajirin. The group had previously made 2 failed attempts to assassinate Irshad, both foiled by police. The third attempt succeeds due to the open nature of the event, making it difficult for police to prevent the attack. Legal consequences. Trial and sentence: Yasin and the other conspirators are tried and found guilty of the assassination plot. Yasin is sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The other 5 members of the group receive 10-year prison sentences each. Summary table: Life of Muhammad Yasin. Aspect. Details. Name: Professor Muhammad Yasin. Origin: Australian-born, Egyptian Arab descent. Education: final year medical student, University of Sydney. Occupation: teacher at Dar Al Huda Islamic School. Marital status: 3 wives, Lebanese, Somali, white Australian, 7 children. Religious group: Al-Muhajirin Al-Muslimin, banned in Australia and UK. Activities: radical Islamic teaching, polygamy, FGM, child marriage, anti-Western activism. Motivation: religious zeal, strict adherence to Sharia, opposition to Western values. Crime: Attempted assassination of Irshad at Sydney Public Crusade. Arrest and sentence. Arrested, tried, sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Key takeaways. Muhammad Yassin is depicted as a highly educated, deeply religious, and radicalized Muslim man whose life is shaped by strict adherence to Sharia law and involvement in extremist groups. His personal life mirrors his ideology, polygamy, strict gender roles, and rejection of Western norms. His radicalization leads him to attempt the assassination of Irshad, motivated by her outspoken criticism of Islam. He is ultimately arrested, tried, and sentenced to life in prison, symbolizing the dangers of religious extremism and the consequences of violent ideology. What is al-Muhajirin's ideology? Al-Muhajirin is a radical Islamist, specifically Salafi jihadist, organization whose core ideology includes 1. Islamist and Salafi jihadist foundations. Its declared purpose is to promote Islamism and Salafi jihadism, rooted in ultra-conservative interpretations of Islam and the use of jihad to establish Islamic rule. The group is openly anti-Western, rejecting secular governance in favor of Sharia, pursuing a global caliphate, and targeting Western societies. 2. Restoration of the caliphate and political activism. It believes in the restoration of the caliphate abolished in 1924, viewing it as essential for an authentic Islamic polity. The group adopts a political methodology, starting with ideological indoctrination, community organizing, and aiming ultimately to seize power through political or militant means. 3. Takfir and jihad. It repeatedly engages in takfir, denouncing other Muslims as unbelievers, which justifies its extremist and violent posture. It encourages violent jihad, praising acts such as the 9/11 attacks, the Magnificent 19, and upholding them as legitimate resistance against the West. 4. Ideological evolution and hybrid theology. Originally influenced by Ash'ari and Maturidi traditionalist theology, it shifted in the late 1990s toward a more militant jihadi Salafist doctrine. The group has blended mainstream Sunni principles with radical jihadist ideology, forming a unique hybrid framework echoing al-Qaeda's outlook. 5. Covenant of security and strategic violations. Its theology includes a concept known as the Covenant of Security, a conditional understanding with non-Muslim states limiting violent actions, but only when that covenant is broken. This doctrine allows the group to justify violent actions when they interpret that non-Muslim governments of Muslim countries or the West have violated that covenant. 6. Recruitment and radicalization strategy. Its recruitment strategy involves cognitive opening, theological persuasion, and gradual socialization into extremism. It effectively operates a transnational network, funding, radicalizing, and facilitating jihadist travel to hotspots like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Syria. 7. Organizational adaptability. Al-Muhajirin has repeatedly rebranded Al-Gharaba, the Saved Sect, Islam for UK, Muslims Against Crusades, Need for Khalifa, Ahlus Sunnah wal Jamaa, to circumvent legal bans. This strategy has helped it persist despite being officially proscribed in the UK as a terrorist organization under multiple aliases. Summary of ideological pillars. Pillar. Description. Core belief. Establishment of a global Islamic caliphate under Sharia. Methodology. Ideological indoctrination, political activism, militant jihad. Theological basis. Hybrid of traditional Sunni and militant Salafi jihadist doctrine. Rejection of West. Considering Western democracy illegitimate, endorses violence. Strategic adaptation. Uses aliases to evade legal bans, globally networked. In summary, Al-Muhajirin's ideology combines extreme Salafi theology, takfirism, political activism, and justification of violent jihad, aimed at dismantling Western influence and re-establishing a transnational Islamic caliphate. Here's a focused summary on Professor Muhammad Yassin, the assassin, his family, his teaching, and his trial, as depicted in the novel. Professor Muhammad Yassin, Family, Teaching, and Trial. 1. Family background. Muhammad Yassin is described as a highly educated Muslim man, born and raised in Australia to Egyptian Arab immigrant parents. He is married and has 7 children with 3 wives. First wife, Arab, originally from Lebanon, 4 children. Second wife, Somali, recently emigrated from a refugee camp in Nairobi, Kenya, 2 sons. Third wife, white woman of British-Australian descent, 1 daughter. Only this third wife is officially registered as his Muslim wife. The other 2 are considered divorced by the Department of Social Work, but Yassin continues to visit and have children with them. Considering all 3 as legitimate wives under Islamic Sharia, which permits polygamy, see Quran, Surah 4, verse 3. 2. Teaching and religious activities. Yassin is a professor and a teacher at Dar al-Huda School in Sydney, a private Islamic school that segregates boys and girls and employs only Muslim staff. He teaches Islamic courses and other academic subjects at Dar al-Huda and is also a medical student in his final year at the University of Sydney. The school's curriculum is heavily religious, requiring students to memorize the Quran, hadiths, and the history of Islamic conquests. Boys are taught about the rewards of jihad and martyrdom, including the promise of 72 virgins in paradise. Yassin is an official teacher at the school, which is described as a center for indoctrinating students in strict Islamic doctrine. He is an active member of the banned Islamic group Al-Muhajirin al-Muslimin, Muslim immigrants, which has been outlawed in Australia and the UK for its extremist activities. The group advocates for Sharia law, polygamy, and other practices and is monitored by Australian police. 3. The assassination plot. Yassin is the assassin who attempts to kill Irshad, the protagonist, during a public Christian crusade in Sydney, where she delivers a controversial speech condemning Islamic texts and practices. The assassination is orchestrated by the leadership of Al-Muhajirin al-Muslimin, with Yassin as the shooter. The group had previously made 2 failed attempts on Irshad's life, but succeeded during the open-air crusade event. 4. The trial and verdict. After the assassination attempt, Yassin and 4 other prominent members of Al-Muhajirin are arrested by Sydney police. Trial. Yassin is tried for the attempted murder of Irshad. The trial is high-profile, given his status as a professor, medical student, and community leader. Verdict. Yassin is found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The other 4 members of the group are sentenced to 10 years in prison each. The trial highlights the dangers of religious extremism and the infiltration of radical ideology into educational institutions. 5. Summary table. Aspect. Details. Family. 3 wives, Lebanese, Somali, British-Australian, 7 children, polygamous under Sharia. Teaching. Professor at Dar al-Huda Islamic School, teaches Islamic and academic subjects. Religious role. Member of band Al-Muhajirin al-Muslimin, active in mosque and Islamic activism. Assassination. Shooter in plot against Irshad, motivated by extremist ideology. Trial outcome. Life imprisonment without parole. Co-conspirators receive 10 years each. Dar al-Huda School in Sydney is a highly distinctive and controversial private Islamic school, fundamentally different from mainstream Australian schools in several key ways. 1. Religious and cultural environment. Exclusively Islamic, Dar al-Huda is a private Islamic school where all students are Muslim and all teachers and staff are also Muslim. Non-Muslims are not employed as teachers or staff, regardless of their qualifications. Gender segregation. The school is divided into 2 separate institutions, Dar al-Huda for boys and Dar al-Huda for girls, though they share the same campus. Boys and girls have separate classrooms and a high partition, compared to the Great Wall of China or the Berlin Wall, divides the 2 sections. 2. Curriculum and daily life. Compulsory Islamic studies. From grade 1 to grade 12, every student is required to study Islamic subjects daily. This includes memorizing the Quran, learning the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad, and studying the history of early Islamic conquests, often referred to as invasions or jihad in the way of Allah. Academic subjects. While academic subjects are taught, Islamic studies are prioritized and integrated into the curriculum. Arabic, Urdu, and Persian languages are also taught alongside English. Religious indoctrination. The school emphasizes strict adherence to Islamic law, Sharia, including practices such as polygamy, female genital mutilation, and gender roles. Boys are taught about the rewards of jihad and martyrdom, including the promise of 72 virgins in paradise for those who die in jihad. 3. Social and behavioral expectations. Strict dress code. All students must adhere to Islamic dress codes. Girls are required to wear hijab, abaya, or niqab, and boys must dress modestly according to Islamic standards. Segregation in activities. Boys and girls do not mix in any school activities, classes, or even during breaks. The school enforces strict gender segregation at all times. Community and family involvement. The school is closely tied to the local Muslim immigrant community, and many families send their children there to ensure they are raised according to traditional Islamic values. Why Dar Al Huda differs from other Australian schools. Religious exclusivity. Unlike public or most private schools in Australia, which are secular or inclusive of multiple faiths, Dar Al Huda is exclusively Islamic in both staff and student body. Curriculum focus. The curriculum is heavily weighted toward religious indoctrination, with daily Islamic studies and memorization of religious texts, which is not the case in mainstream Australian schools. Gender segregation. The physical and social separation of boys and girls is far stricter than in typical Australian schools, where coeducation is the norm. Cultural isolation. The school creates a self-contained environment that limits exposure to broader Australian society and values, reinforcing traditional and sometimes controversial practices that are not accepted or legal in mainstream Australia, such as polygamy, FGM, strict gender roles. Community influence. The school is a hub for the local Muslim immigrant community, and its practices reflect the cultural and religious norms of that community rather than those of wider Australian society. 5. Summary table. Aspect. Dar Al Huda School, Sydney. Mainstream Australian schools. Religious focus. Exclusively Islamic, daily religious studies. Secular or multi-faith, religion optional. Staff/students. All Muslim, no non-Muslim staff or students. Mixed backgrounds, inclusive. Gender segregation. Complete separation, separate classes/campuses. Mostly coeducational. Curriculum. Heavy on Quran, Hadith, Islamic history. Standard Australian curriculum. Dress code. Strict Islamic dress for all. Uniforms or casual, less restrictive. Community role. Central to Muslim immigrant community. Integrated with broader society. In summary, Dar Al Huda School in Sydney is fundamentally different from other Australian schools due to its exclusive Islamic environment, strict gender segregation, daily religious indoctrination, and reinforcement of traditional practices. It operates as a cultural and religious enclave, prioritizing Islamic law and values over integration with mainstream Australian society. The Islamic texts used to teach jihad, especially in the context of Dar Al Huda School and similar Muslim institutions, are primarily 1. The Quran. Verses on jihad. The curriculum emphasizes memorization and recitation of Quranic verses that command or encourage jihad, holy war, against non-Muslims, infidels, apostates, and those considered enemies of Islam. Examples cited include: fighting is ordained for you, and it is hateful to you, Surah Al-Baqarah 2, verse 216. And fight them until there is no fitna and the religion is entirely for Allah, Surah Al-Anfal 8, verse 39. Then when the sacred months have passed, kill the idolaters wherever you find them, Surah Al-Tawbah 9, verse 5, known as the verse of the sword. Fight those who do not believe in God nor in the last day, Surah Al-Tawbah 9, verse 29. So, when you meet those who disbelieve, smite the necks, Surah Muhammad 47, verse 4. O you who have believed, Fight those of the disbelievers who are close to you. Surah Al-Tawbah 9, verse 123. 2. Hadith, sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. Jihad-related hadiths. The curriculum includes memorization and study of hadiths that explicitly command Muslims to fight non-believers, glorify martyrdom, and promise rewards for those who die in jihad. Examples include, I have been commanded to fight the people until they testify that there is no God but Allah and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan Abu Dawud. Paradise is under the shadows of swords. Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. Whoever changes his religion, kill him. Sahih al-Bukhari. God guarantees whoever strives in his cause. He will enter paradise if he is martyred. Sahih al-Bukhari. The messenger of God said, fight everyone in the way of God and kill those who disbelieve in God. Ibn Ishaq. The messenger of God said, there is no emigration after the conquest of Mecca except for jihad. When a Muslim ruler calls you to fight in jihad, you must immediately go out and heed the call. Sahih al-Bukhari. 3. Classical Islamic jurisprudence and historical texts. Sharia law. The curriculum draws on classical interpretations of Sharia that define jihad as a religious obligation and detail the rules for waging war, treatment of non-Muslims, and the rewards for martyrs. History of Islamic invasions. Students are taught about the early Islamic conquests, the lives of famous Muslim generals, and the expansion of Islam by the sword, reinforcing the idea that jihad is a central and heroic part of Islamic history. 4. School-specific curriculum. Memorization. At Dar al-Huda and similar schools, students are required to memorize large portions of the Quran and hadiths, especially those related to jihad, martyrdom, and the rewards of paradise, such as the promise of 72 virgins for martyrs. Ideological indoctrination. The teaching is not just academic, but is designed to instill a militant worldview, glorifying martyrdom and jihad as the highest religious duties for Muslim males. In summary, the texts used to teach jihad in Dar al-Huda school and similar institutions are primarily the Quran, especially Medinan verses on fighting and conquest, the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad on jihad, martyrdom, and violence against non-believers, and classical Islamic jurisprudence and history that glorify jihad as a religious and heroic duty. The curriculum is structured to ensure students memorize, internalize, and are ideologically committed to these teachings. The teaching of jihad to students, especially in institutions like Dar al-Huda School in Sydney and similar religious schools, is described as a systematic, immersive, and highly ideological process. Here's a focused summary of how jihad is taught to students based strictly on the content of the novel. 1. Memorization of core texts. Quranic verses. Students are required to memorize large portions of the Quran, with special emphasis on verses that command or glorify jihad, holy war, against non-Muslims, apostates, and those considered enemies of Islam. These include the so-called verse of the sword, Surah Al-Tawbah 9, verse 5, and other verses that explicitly call for fighting, conquest, and the subjugation of non-believers. Hadiths. Students also memorize hadiths, sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad that command Muslims to fight, glorify martyrdom, and promise rewards for those who die in jihad, such as paradise is under the shadows of swords and I have been commanded to fight the people until they testify that there is no God but Allah and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. 2. Daily religious instruction. Compulsory Islamic studies. Every day, students attend classes dedicated to Islamic studies, which include the Quran, hadiths, and the history of early Islamic conquests. The curriculum is designed to instill the belief that jihad is a religious obligation and a heroic act. History lessons. Students are taught about the lives of famous Muslim generals and the expansion of Islam by the sword, reinforcing the idea that jihad is central to Islamic history and identity. 3. Ideological indoctrination. Glorification of martyrdom. The teaching is not just academic, it is designed to instill a militant worldview. Martyrdom in jihad is presented as the highest religious duty for Muslim males, with the promise of rewards in paradise, such as 72 virgins, for those who die fighting for Islam. Demonization of non-Muslims. Students are taught to view non-Muslims, infidels, apostates, and even moderate Muslims as enemies of Islam, and are encouraged to see themselves as part of a global struggle. 4. Discipline and enforcement. Strict memorization. Failure to memorize the required verses or hadiths results in severe punishment, such as flogging. The environment is highly disciplined and punitive, ensuring compliance and internalization of the teachings. Segregation by gender. Boys are trained for jihad, while girls are confined to domestic roles and taught to support jihad by raising future fighters and enduring hardship. 6. Summary table. How jihad is taught. Method. Description. Memorization. Quranic verses and hadiths on jihad and martyrdom. Daily religious instruction. Compulsory classes on Islamic law, history, and conquests. Ideological indoctrination. Glorification of martyrdom, demonization of non-Muslims, promise of rewards in paradise. Discipline and enforcement. Punishments for failure, strict compliance, gender segregation. In summary, jihad is taught to students through a combination of rote memorization of religious texts, daily ideological instruction, glorification of violence and martyrdom, strict discipline, and eventual transition to military training. The process is designed to ensure that students not only know the religious justifications for jihad, but are also psychologically and practically prepared to participate in it. Here's a focused, evidence-based comparison of Dar al-Huda School in Sydney, Australia, and the Madrasa in Pakistan, where the Frenchman Mohammed Noor and his American wife Nadia were taught true Islam, based strictly on the content of the novel. Dar al-Huda School, Sydney, Australia. Overview. Dar al-Huda is a private Islamic school in Sydney, established and run by Muslim immigrants. The school is divided into two separate sections, one for boys and one for girls, with a partition as high as the Great Wall of China and as strong as the Berlin Wall. All teachers and staff are Muslims. Non-Muslims are not employed in any capacity. The curriculum includes daily compulsory Islamic studies from grade 1 to grade 12, focusing on the Quran, hadiths, and the history of early Islamic conquests. Students are required to memorize Quranic verses and hadiths, especially those related to jihad, martyrdom, and the rewards of paradise. Boys are taught about the beauty of the virgins of paradise and the rewards awaiting martyrs, reinforcing the glorification of jihad. The school enforces strict gender segregation and Islamic dress codes, and girls are taught domestic roles and obedience. Why it differs from other Australian schools. Unlike secular Australian schools, Dar al-Huda is entirely faith-based, with a curriculum and environment shaped by strict interpretations of Islam. There is no integration with non-Muslim students or teachers. The school is insular and self-contained. The focus on memorization of religious texts, gender segregation, and the glorification of jihad and martyrdom is unique and not found in mainstream Australian education. The school's approach to discipline is harsh, with severe punishments for failure to memorize or comply with religious rules. Madrasa in Pakistan, attended by Mohammed Noor and Nadia Noor. Overview. The madrasa is described as the most prestigious Islamic school in Pakistan, with a reputation comparable to Harvard or Oxford in the West, but for producing the highest number of suicide bombers and jihadist leaders. The curriculum is centered on memorizing the Quran, hadiths, and Sharia law, with a heavy emphasis on the obligation of jihad and the history of Islamic conquests. Students are required to memorize all 114 chapters of the Quran and large numbers of hadiths, especially those glorifying jihad and martyrdom. The teaching is highly ideological, focusing on indoctrination into Salafi jihadist beliefs, glorification of martyrdom, and the promise of rewards in paradise, such as 72 virgins. The environment is extremely strict and punitive. Failure to memorize is met with flogging. After graduation, Boys are sent to mujahideen camps for military training, learning bomb making, guerrilla tactics, and suicide operations. Girls are excluded from jihad training and are confined to domestic roles, taught that their jihad is to endure pain in sexual intercourse and serve their husbands. Why it differs from other schools. The madrasa is not just a religious school, but a center for militant indoctrination and preparation for violent jihad. The curriculum is almost entirely religious, with minimal secular education, basic arithmetic, and language. The school is designed to produce future jihadists, not just religious scholars or community leaders. The environment is more extreme than Dar al-Huda, with a direct pipeline from religious indoctrination to militant training and operations. Key differences. Aspect. Dar al-Huda, Sydney. Madrasa, Pakistan. Location. Sydney, Australia. Pakistan, Swat Valley, etc. Curriculum. Quran, Hadiths, Islamic history, some secular subjects. Quran, Hadiths, Sharia, Jihad, minimal secular. Focus. Religious identity, gender segregation, discipline. Militant indoctrination, jihad, martyrdom. Jihad teaching. Glorified, but less direct military training. Central, with direct transition to military camps. Discipline. Harsh, but within Australian legal limits. Extremely harsh, flogging for failure. Gender roles. Segregated, girls taught domesticity. Segregated, girls excluded from jihad, domesticity. Integration. Insular, but within a Western society. Isolated, fully immersed in militant environment. Outcome. Religious identity, some radicalization. Pipeline to jihadist activity and terrorism. Summary. Dar al-Huda School in Sydney is a highly insular, faith-based Islamic school with strict gender segregation, daily religious indoctrination, and a focus on memorizing texts that glorify jihad. However, it operates within the broader context of Australian law and society. The madrasa in Pakistan is far more extreme, functioning as a pipeline for producing jihadists and suicide bombers, with a curriculum almost entirely focused on religious and militant indoctrination, and direct transition to military training camps. Both schools differ fundamentally from mainstream Australian, or Western, schools, which are secular, coeducational, and focused on critical thinking, diversity, and integration. Here's another detailed comparison focusing evidence-based contrast of Dar al-Huda School in Sydney, Australia, and the madrasa in Pakistan where Muhammad Noor and Nadia Noor were taught, with a special emphasis on gender roles in both institutions. Dar al-Huda School in Sydney. Overview. Dar al-Huda is a private Islamic school in Sydney, Australia, attended by children of Muslim immigrants. The school is divided into two separate institutions under one name, Dar al-Huda for boys and Dar al-Huda for girls. All teachers and staff are Muslims. Non-Muslims are not employed in any capacity. The curriculum includes daily Islamic studies, focusing on the Quran, Hadiths, and the history of early Islamic invasions by the sword when Muslim mujahideen reached Spain in the west and India in the east. Boys and girls are strictly segregated, with separate classrooms and facilities, divided by a partition as high as the Great Wall of China. The school enforces strict Islamic dress codes and gender roles. Gender roles. Boys and girls are taught separately from grade 1 to grade 12. Boys are taught about the glories of jihad, the rewards of martyrdom, including the promise of 72 virgins in paradise and the history of Islamic conquests. Girls are taught domestic skills and are prepared for traditional roles as wives and mothers. The curriculum for girls emphasizes obedience, modesty, and the importance of serving their husbands and families. Girls are not taught about jihad in the sense of armed struggle. Their jihad is defined as fulfilling their domestic and marital duties. The school enforces strict gender segregation and traditional Islamic gender roles, with girls expected to cover themselves and avoid interaction with boys. Why it differs from other Australian schools. Most Australian schools are secular, coeducational, and emphasize gender equality, critical thinking, and a broad curriculum including sciences, arts, and humanities. Dar al-Huda is unique in its strict segregation, religious curriculum, and enforcement of traditional gender roles. The school's focus on memorization of religious texts and the glorification of early Islamic conquests sets it apart from the mainstream Australian educational system, which values inquiry, diversity, and inclusivity. Madrasa in Pakistan, where Muhammad Noor and Nadia Noor studied. Overview. The madrasa is a prestigious Islamic religious school in Pakistan, renowned for producing jihadists and suicide bombers. The curriculum is centered on memorizing the Quran, hadiths, and learning Sharia law, with a strong emphasis on the obligation of jihad and the history of Islamic conquests. Students are required to memorize all 114 chapters of the Quran and are severely punished for failing to do so. The madrasa is notorious for indoctrinating students into a militant, Salafi jihadist ideology. Gender roles. Boys are the primary students. They are trained for jihad, including military training, bomb-making, and preparation for suicide missions. Boys are taught that martyrdom brings great rewards in paradise, including the promise of 72 virgins. Girls are not allowed to participate in jihad training or military activities. Girls' education is limited to religious instruction and domestic skills. Their jihad is defined as serving their husbands and enduring pain in marriage. Girls are prepared for early marriage, domestic servitude, and strict obedience to male authority. Gender segregation is absolute, and girls are denied opportunities for personal development or public life. Comparison table. Gender roles in Dar al-Huda in Australia versus Madrasa in Pakistan. Aspect. Dar al-Huda, Sydney. Madrasa, Pakistan. Student segregation. Boys and girls strictly separated, separate schools. Boys primary students, girls excluded from jihad. Curriculum. Quran, hadiths, Islamic history, gendered roles. Quran, hadiths, Sharia, jihad, gendered roles. Boys' role. Taught about jihad, martyrdom, leadership. Trained for jihad, military training, martyrdom. Girls' role. Domestic skills, obedience, modesty, marriage prep. Domestic servitude, early marriage, obedience. Jihad teaching. Boys taught about jihad as religious duty. Girls, jihad is domestic. Boys trained for armed jihad. Girls, jihad is serving husbands. Dress code. Strict Islamic dress for girls, modesty enforced. Strict Islamic dress, girls confined to homes/tents. Public life. Girls limited, boys encouraged to lead. Girls denied, boys prepared for public/religious leadership. Critical thinking. Discouraged, focus on memorization. Discouraged, focus on memorization and obedience. Summary of gender roles. Both institutions enforce strict gender segregation and traditional roles. Boys are prepared for leadership and, in the case of the madrasa, for armed jihad. Girls are prepared for domesticity, obedience, and early marriage. Dar al-Huda in Sydney is unique in Australia for its strict adherence to Islamic gender roles, religious curriculum, and segregation, making it fundamentally different from mainstream Australian schools. The madrasa in Pakistan is even more extreme, with boys indoctrinated for violent jihad and girls denied almost all opportunities outside of domestic servitude. After Susan Ershad regains her memory in Australia, her public activism becomes a central and powerful part of her life's final chapters. Here's a detailed summary of her activism, based strictly on the content of the novel. 1. Reclaiming her identity and voice. After surviving years of abuse, trauma, and even an assassination attempt that left her with amnesia, Susan eventually regains her memory through medical treatment and support from her family and her American lover. With her memory restored, she feels a renewed sense of mission to expose the abuses she and countless other women suffered under the teachings of the main texts of Islam and to fight for the rights and dignity of women everywhere. 2. Founding the Association of Abused Muslim Women. Susan founds and leads the Association of Abused Muslim Women, an organization dedicated to supporting ex-Muslim women who have escaped abusive environments. She sponsors women who want to leave oppressive situations and come to live in the West, and she encourages survivors to share their testimonies, offering to publish them at her own expense. The association grows rapidly, with hundreds of ex-Muslim women joining and sharing their stories. Susan organizes meetings in churches and public venues, giving these women a platform to speak for themselves. 3. Publishing and public speaking. Susan writes and publishes a best-selling book entitled Irshad and the Abuse of Muslim Women, which includes her own testimony and those of 6 other remarkable female survivors from Egypt, Sudan, Somalia, Pakistan, Syria, and the USA. Her friend Nadia. The book is translated into Arabic and widely circulated, becoming a global bestseller and sparking international discussion. She spends lavishly on publishing, organizing events, and supporting branches of her association in other countries, such as the USA, where Nadia starts a branch. Susan is invited to speak at churches, universities, and public events in Australia, Canada, France, and beyond. Her speeches are described as fearless, direct, and emotionally charged, focusing on the abuse of women, the roots of religious extremism, and the need for reform and protection of women's rights. 4. Advocacy and campaigns. Susan uses her financial compensation from legal victories and government settlements to support her activism and the Women's Association. She sponsors the escape and resettlement of abused women, funds their education, and provides legal and emotional support. She encourages women to write and publish their testimonies, helping to break the silence around abuse and oppression. 5. Facing backlash and threats. Susan's activism is met with fierce resistance from some Muslim communities and religious leaders who accuse her of apostasy and blasphemy. She receives threats and is targeted for assassination, but she refuses to be silenced. She is banned from speaking at certain universities, such as McMaster University in Canada, and faces protests and legal challenges, but she continues her campaign, believing that breaking the silence is vital for the safety and dignity of women. 6. International impact. Susan's association and her book inspire similar organizations and campaigns in other countries. Her friend Nadia, for example, starts a branch of the association in the USA. Her work is recognized by human rights activists, women's rights advocates, and the media, and she becomes a symbol of survival, resilience, and the fight against religious justified abuse. 7. Personal healing and legacy. Susan's activism is not just public but deeply personal. She uses her resources to rebuild her family, support her children and grandchildren, and ensure their education and well-being. Even after suffering amnesia from an assassination attempt, her writings and speeches continue to inspire others, and her association remains active, helping women escape cycles of abuse and oppression. In summary, after regaining her memory, Susan Irshad becomes a tireless public advocate for abused women, founding a global association, publishing bestsellers, sponsoring survivors, and speaking out against religious extremism and misogyny. Despite threats and backlash, she uses her voice, resources, and personal story to empower others, drive social change, and leave a legacy of hope and resilience. After Susan Irshad regains her memory in Australia, she faces a series of significant and often daunting challenges in her public activism and personal life. Here's a detailed summary of the main challenges she encounters, based strictly on the content of the novel. 1. Physical and psychological trauma. Susan suffers from years of abuse, torture, rape, and imprisonment in Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and even in Western countries. She is left with physical scars, chronic health issues, and deep psychological wounds, including PTSD, depression, and periods of suicidal ideation. After an assassination attempt at a public crusade in Sydney, she is shot in the head, falls into a coma, and loses her memory for 3 years. Even after regaining her memory, she continues to struggle with the emotional aftermath of her experiences. 2. Social isolation and stigma. Upon returning to Australia, Susan initially lives in poverty and isolation, estranged from her children, who are in Canada, and her parents. She is stigmatized as the wife of a notorious terrorist and faces suspicion from both the broader public and the Muslim community. The Muslim community in Sydney brands her an apostate and infidel after she publicly returns to Christianity, and she receives threats to her life. Some Muslim leaders issue a fatwa calling for her death, and she is forced to seek police protection. 3. Legal and bureaucratic barriers. Susan faces legal battles to regain custody of her children, who have been adopted by Christian families in Canada. Despite her efforts, courts and social services repeatedly deny her custody, citing the children's emotional attachment to their adoptive families and the severance of the maternal bond due to long separation. She is placed on a no-fly list by the CIA after her release from Guantanamo Bay, which prevents her from traveling to see her children or advocate internationally until her name is finally removed after lengthy legal efforts. 4. Threats, violence, and assassination attempts. Susan's outspoken activism makes her a target for assassination and kidnapping plots by radical groups and criminal gangs, including a high-profile kidnapping by the Mad Cow Gang in Canada, orchestrated with the involvement of international terrorist financiers. She survives an assassination attempt at a public crusade in Sydney, which leaves her in a coma and with temporary amnesia. 5. Backlash and censorship. Her speeches and writings, which explicitly criticize the Quran and Hadiths as sources of terrorism and misogyny, provoke outrage among Muslim communities and some academics. She is accused of hate speech, banned from speaking at certain universities, such as McMaster University in Canada, and faces protests and legal challenges. Even in Western countries, she faces institutional resistance and is sometimes expelled from venues by police. 6. Emotional and family challenges. Susan must rebuild relationships with her estranged children and parents, who have also suffered from her long absence and the stigma attached to her past. She struggles with guilt over the suffering of her children, the loss of some to violence or indoctrination, and the trauma endured by her daughter Aisha and others. 7. Ongoing security risks. Even after regaining her memory and resuming her activism, Susan continues to receive threats from extremists and must remain vigilant about her safety and that of her family. 8. Navigating multicultural and political tensions. Susan's campaign to expose abuses within the teachings of the main texts of Islam brings her into conflict with multicultural policies, accusations of Islamophobia, and debates about free speech versus hate speech in Western societies. In summary, Susan's activism after regaining her memory is marked by resilience and courage, but she faces a relentless series of challenges: trauma, social isolation, legal barriers, violence, backlash, and ongoing threats. Despite these obstacles, she persists in her mission to advocate for abused women, expose injustice, and use her story to inspire change. The Association of Abused Muslim Women, founded by Susan Peterson, formerly Irshad, is a global advocacy and support organization dedicated to helping women who have suffered abuse, oppression, and violence under the teachings of the main Islamic texts and patriarchal customs. Here are the main goals and activities of the association, as described in the novel. 1. Support and empowerment for survivors. The association provides a safe space for ex-Muslim women and survivors of abuse to share their testimonies and experiences. It offers emotional, legal, and financial support to women seeking to escape abusive environments, including sponsoring their resettlement in Western countries. 2. Public testimony and awareness. Susan encourages women to write and publish their stories of abuse and oppression, promising to cover the costs of publication herself. The association organizes meetings in churches and public venues, allowing battered Muslim women to speak for themselves and raise awareness about their struggles. 3. Advocacy and activism. The association campaigns for the protection of women's rights, the exposure of misogynistic practices, and the reform of Islamic laws and customs that enable abuse. It challenges the silence and stigma surrounding abuse in religious and cultural contexts, aiming to break the cycle of violence and empower women to reclaim their dignity. 4. International outreach and solidarity. The association has inspired the creation of branches in other countries, such as the USA, where Susan's friend Nadia starts a branch. It fosters a global network of solidarity among survivors, activists, and supporters, amplifying the voices of abused women worldwide. 5. Education and prevention. The association invests in the education of survivors and their children, ensuring they have access to safe schooling and opportunities for personal growth. It works to inform the public, policymakers, and communities about the realities of abuse and the need for systemic change. 6. Publishing and media. Susan uses her resources to publish books, organize events, and support the dissemination of testimonies and research on women's rights and abuse. The association's publications, including Susan's own best-selling book, have reached a global audience and sparked international discussion. In summary, the Association of Abused Muslim Women seeks to support, empower, and give voice to women who have suffered abuse, to raise public awareness, to advocate for legal and social reform, and to build a global network of solidarity and hope for female survivors. Its mission is rooted in breaking the silence, exposing injustice, and helping women reclaim their dignity and freedom. Based on the novel The Association of Abused Muslim Women, founded by Susan Peterson, formerly Irshad Al-Shamari, is a pivotal organization in her post-trauma activism. Here's a summary of its goals and the reforms it advocates for. Goals of the Association of Abused Muslim Women. Support and empowerment for survivors. The association provides a safe space for ex-Muslim women who have suffered abuse and oppression to share their testimonies and support each other. It encourages women who have escaped abusive environments to come forward, offering to publish their stories and testimonies at the association's expense. Practical assistance. The association sponsors women who want to escape abusive situations and helps them resettle in Western countries. It offers financial aid, legal support, and assistance with education and resettlement for abused women and their children. Awareness and advocacy. The association organizes meetings, public speeches, and campaigns to raise awareness about the abuse of Muslim women and girls. It aims to expose the realities of practices such as female genital mutilation, child marriage, polygamy, domestic violence, and the denial of women's rights as experienced by its female members. Publishing and education. Susan Peterson uses her resources to publish books and testimonies of abused women, making their stories accessible to a global audience. The association's publications are intended to educate both Muslim and non-Muslim communities about the realities of abuse and the need for reform. Reforms advocated by the association. Legal and social reform. The association calls for the abolition of practices such as female genital mutilation, child marriage, forced polygamy, and domestic violence, which are justified by religious texts, the Quran and Hadiths. It advocates for equal legal rights for women, including the right to education, freedom of movement, and protection from abuse. Religious reform and critical examination. The association urges a critical examination of religious texts, Quran and Hadiths, that are used to justify the abuse and subjugation of women. It calls for reinterpretation or rejection of misogynistic teachings and supports the secularization of legal systems in Muslim-majority countries. Freedom of speech and protection for activists. The association defends the right to speak out against abuse and religious extremism, rejecting the silencing of critics through accusations of Islamophobia or hate speech. It campaigns for the protection of women's rights activists and survivors who face threats, violence, or legal repercussions for their advocacy. International solidarity. The association encourages global solidarity among women's rights organizations, churches, and secular groups to support female survivors and push for change. It has inspired the creation of branches in other countries, like the USA, led by Susan's friend Nadia. Summary table: Association's core aims and reforms. Goals/advocacy. Description: Survivor support. Safe space, testimony sharing, practical aid. Awareness and education. Public speeches, publishing, global outreach. Legal and social reform. End FGM, child marriage, polygamy, domestic violence. Promote women's rights. Religious reform. Critical examination of texts, secularization, reinterpretation of doctrine. Freedom of speech. Defend activists, reject silencing, protect critics. International solidarity. Build alliances, support branches worldwide. In essence, the Association of Abused Muslim Women is dedicated to supporting survivors, exposing abuse, advocating for legal and religious reform, and empowering women to reclaim their rights and dignity. Contributions of Aisha and Nadia to the Association of Abused Muslim Women. Aisha's contributions. Testimony and advocacy. After being rescued from years of captivity, child marriage, and abuse, Aisha joins her mother Irshad's Association of Abused Muslim Women. She shares her own harrowing story of being kidnapped, raped, and imprisoned as a minor by Mullah Muhammad Abu Hamid. Her testimony is included among the most powerful in the association's publications, serving as a voice for countless girls subjected to similar abuses under the guise of religious law. Public speaking. Aisha participates in meetings and gatherings organized by the association, recounting her experiences to raise awareness about the realities of child marriage, sexual violence, and the exploitation of girls in extremist environments. Inspiration for others. Her courage in sharing her story encourages other survivors to come forward, breaking the silence around abuse and helping to build a supportive community for ex-Muslim women. Nadia's contributions. Testimony and branch leadership. Nadia Noor, an American woman who converted to Islam, married a French jihadist, and endured abuse and disillusionment, is invited by Irshad to Australia to share her testimony at a large gathering of the association. Her story of being deceived by idealized portrayals of Islam, trapped in terrorist strongholds, and ultimately escaping and returning to Christianity becomes a cornerstone of the association's advocacy. Founding the U.S. branch. After returning to the United States, Nadia, encouraged by Irshad, founds the first branch of the Association of Abused Muslim Women in the USA. She organizes meetings, supports other female survivors, and helps publish testimonies of abused women, expanding the association's reach and impact internationally. Empowerment and solidarity. Nadia's leadership and willingness to speak out inspire other American and Western women to join the movement, fostering solidarity and cross-cultural support for female survivors of religious and domestic abuse. 2. How Nadia started the U.S. branch. Invitation and testimony. Nadia is first invited by Irshad to Australia, where she shares her story at a major event for the Association of Abused Muslim Women. Her testimony is well received and becomes a catalyst for further activism. Encouragement and support. With Irshad's encouragement and financial backing, Nadia returns to the United States and establishes the first American branch of the association. Irshad provides funding and logistical support, enabling Nadia to organize meetings, publish testimonies, and offer resources to abused women in the U.S. Network building. Nadia leverages her own experience and connections to reach out to other survivors, encouraging them to share their stories and join the association. She helps create a safe space for ex-Muslim and abused women to find support and healing. 3. Comparison of the testimonies of Irshad, Aisha, and Nadia. Aspect. Irshad, Susan Peterson. Aisha, Irshad's daughter. Nadia Noor. Background. Australian Christian, converts to Islam, marries a Saudi, endures abuse in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, escapes, returns to Christianity. Born in Australia, raised up in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, kidnapped and forced into child marriage at age 10, suffers years of rape and servitude. American, converts to Islam, marries French jihadist, trapped in terrorist strongholds, disillusioned, escapes, returns to Christianity. Nature of abuse. Domestic violence, forced isolation, FGM for her daughters, polygamy, forced conversion, imprisonment, rape, loss of children, wrongful imprisonment, assassination attempts. Child marriage, repeated rape by husband and his sons, forced servitude, isolation, loss of childhood, psychological trauma. Polygamy, emotional neglect, forced to accept child marriage of co-wives, trapped in terrorist environment, loss of autonomy, fear for children. Turning point. Escape from Afghanistan, return to faith, activism for women's rights. Rescue by mother, reunion, begins healing and education. Escape from terrorist husband, reconversion to Christianity, begins advocacy. Role in association. Founder, leader, public speaker, author, sponsor of other survivors. Testifier, advocate, inspiration for other female survivors. U.S. branch founder, public speaker, organizer, advocate. Testimony focus. Systemic abuse of women under religious law, personal journey from victim to advocate, call for reform and exposure of religious texts. Personal trauma of child marriage and sexual abuse, loss of innocence, journey to healing and education. Deception by idealized Islam, reality of misogyny and violence, journey from faith to disillusionment to activism. Impact. Inspires and empowers other women, drives international advocacy, challenges religious and cultural taboos. Gives voice to child victims, encourages others to break silence, highlights generational trauma. Expands movement to U.S., bridges Western and Muslim survivor experiences, empowers others to speak out. Summary of differences and similarities. Irshad's testimony is the most comprehensive, covering a wide range of abuses and a long journey from victimhood to global advocacy. She is the founder and central figure of the association. Aisha's testimony is intensely personal and focuses on the trauma of child marriage, sexual abuse, and the struggle to reclaim her life. Her story is a powerful example of generational abuse and the resilience of survivors. Nadia's testimony bridges Western and Muslim experiences, highlighting the dangers of idealized religious conversion, the reality of misogyny in extremist environments, and the importance of solidarity and activism. She is instrumental in expanding the association's reach to the U.S. Here are direct excerpts from the testimonies of Irshad, Aisha, and Nadia, along with further details about their roles and impact within the Association of Abused Muslim Women, as described in the novel. Irshad, Susan Peterson testimony, role, and impact. Direct excerpts from her testimony. She shares her own story of suffering, being beaten, raped, and subjected to humiliating sexual practices by her husband and witnessing her children's abuse. She describes the scars on her body and the trauma endured by her family as evidence of the systemic nature of the problem. Irshad gave the example of the Prophet Muhammad's scandalous marriage to the child daughter of his friend Abu Bakr, the child bride Aisha, whom he married when she was 6 years old, raped her and began physically abusing her when she was 9 years old. Her daughter, Aisha, was also married at the age of 10 to an old Afghani man, without her mother's knowledge or consent. The Muslim man who married her is 70 years old, and that is older than her grandfather. She also showed the scars of severe beatings on her body at the hands of her late Muslim husband, who had been brutally beating her and violating the sanctity of her body in abnormal and humiliating sexual ways over a period of 7 years. Role and impact. Founder and leader. Irshad is the founder of the Association of Abused Muslim Women. She organizes meetings, encourages other female survivors to share their stories, and uses her own experience as a rallying point for advocacy. Public speaker and author, she gives speeches internationally, Canada, France, Australia, writes books, and funds the publication of testimonies from other survivors. Her activism is described as fearless and direct, challenging both religious and cultural taboos. Empowerment. Her story inspires other women to break their silence, seek help, and join the movement for reform and justice. She also provides financial support for Muslim women and girls escaping abuse and helps sponsor their resettlement in the West. Aisha, Irshad's daughter testimony, role, and impact. Direct excerpts from her testimony. She shares her own harrowing story of being kidnapped, raped, and imprisoned as a minor by Mullah Muhammad Abu Hamid. Her testimony is included among the most powerful in the association's publications, serving as a voice for countless Muslim girls subjected to similar abuses under the guise of religious law. Aisha recounted to her mother, Irshad, her bitter experience in marriage when she was 10 years old, and how she was abused and exploited by the senior wives of Mullah Muhammad Abu Hamid. How brutally the old mullah raped her as soon as their mother left them in his custody. It is very heartbreaking and painful to repeat what Aisha had to go through at the age of 10 at the hands of the evil and rude old man. She recounted how the mullah's wives hated her and often beat her because the old man showed more interest in her than his older wives. Whenever the mullah went out of the house, the wives forced her to do all the work in the large residence and even forced her to massage and bathe their bodies. She had to take care of the children of these Afghan women and her own young children as well. Even foreign maidservants in Saudi Arabia and the Arab Gulf countries are not treated the way Aisha was abused by these Afghan women. The daughter confessed to her Australian mother that she had been raped several times by 3 of Mullah Muhammad Abu Hamid's sons. From time to time, someone would attack her when she was naked in the bathroom taking shower or using the toilet, or she was sleeping alone at night in her room, and he would rape her like a dog rape its bitch. Therefore, the daughter believed that 1 or 2 of her children were born because of incest. Role and impact. Testifier and advocate. Aisha's testimony is a centerpiece of the association's advocacy, highlighting the trauma of child marriage, sexual abuse, and forced servitude. Her willingness to speak out encourages other female survivors, especially those girls who were abused as children, to come forward. Inspiration. Her story is used in association meetings and publications to illustrate the generational impact of abuse and the urgent need for reform. Empowerment. By sharing her experience, Aisha helps break the silence around taboo subjects and inspires other young women to seek help and healing. Nadia Noor, testimony, role, and impact. Direct excerpts from her testimony. Nadia, in particular, is shocked by the misogynistic practices, polygamy, and violence she witnesses. She finds herself trapped in a world of extremism, unable to escape, and ultimately regrets her conversion. Nadia confides in Irshad about her misery and her desire to escape with her children and return to America. Irshad, in turn, shares her own tragic story and her determination to find her missing sons. Nadia's journey mirrors Irshad's. She is drawn to Islam by idealized promises, only to be confronted by harsh realities of misogyny, violence, and loss of autonomy. Despite immense suffering, Nadia finds the courage to reclaim her faith and identity and to help others escape similar fates. Nadia told Irshad that she did something good by abandoning the dreaded Islam that was filled with misogynistic teachings and terrorism and returning to Christianity, the peaceful religion that values women and gives them equal rights with their male counterparts. She also told her that if she could escape from Pakistan and return to her country, America, she would do the same and openly expose the deceptions and evils of Islam. The Australian widow Irshad encouraged the American wife Nadia to start praying to Jesus Christ even before she ran away. Nadia followed the advice of her friend Irshad and apostatized from Islam, reconverted to Christianity, and started praying to the Lord Jesus from her heart. Role and impact. U.S. branch founder. After returning to the U.S., Nadia, with Irshad's encouragement and financial support, founds the first American branch of the Association of Abused Muslim Women. She organizes meetings, supports other female survivors, and helps publish testimonies of abused women, expanding the association's reach and impact internationally. Public speaker and organizer, Nadia's testimony is featured at major association events, and she becomes a prominent advocate for women's rights and survivor support in the U.S. Empowerment and solidarity. Nadia's leadership and willingness to speak out inspire other American and Western women to join the movement, fostering solidarity and cross-cultural support for female survivors of religious and domestic abuse. Further details on their roles and impact. Irshad is the central figure, using her story to found and lead the association, sponsor other survivors, and drive international advocacy. Her activism is both personal and systemic, targeting the root causes of abuse in religious texts and cultural practices. Aisha provides a powerful, personal account of child marriage and sexual abuse, serving as a voice for the most vulnerable female victims. Her testimony is used to educate, inspire, and mobilize support for reform. Nadia Noor bridges the Western and Muslim survivor experience, expanding the association's reach to the U.S. and empowering other female converts and Western women who have suffered similar fates. Her leadership in the U.S. branch helps create a global network of support and advocacy. Susan Peterson, formerly Irshad Al-Shamari, writes and publishes a powerful book after her return to Australia, drawing on her own harrowing experiences and the testimonies of other women who have suffered abuse under religious texts of Islamic law and culture. About the book. Title: The book is referred to as Irshad and the Abuse of Muslim Women, translated and published in Arabic under the same title. Content: It is a memoir and a collection of testimonies, blending Susan's personal story with those of other female survivors. The book details her years of abuse in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, her escape, her activism, and her journey from victim to advocate. Purpose: The book aims to expose the realities of abuse, oppression, and violence faced by women in some Islamic societies, and to give voice to those who have been silenced. It is both a personal testimony and a call to action for reform and support for abused women. Other testimonies included. Susan's book is notable for including not just her own story, but also the testimonies of 6 other remarkable women, making it a collective voice for female survivors. Ikram Hafez, an Egyptian woman who endured severe abuse. Insaf Salah Al-Junaid, a young woman from Sudan who suffered under oppressive customs. Aisha Abdul Qadir, a Somali wife who shares her experience of violence and forced marriage. Shabana Siddiqui, a Pakistani sister who recounts her struggles with family and societal expectations. Layla Haddad, a Syrian daughter who describes her journey through abuse and survival. Nadia Noor, an American woman, Susan's close friend, who converted to Islam, married a notorious terrorist, and later escaped and reconverted to Christianity. Nadia's story is especially prominent, as she also founds a branch of the Association of Abused Muslim Women in the USA. Susan Peterson's own testimony. Her story is the centerpiece, detailing her transformation from a hopeful Australian woman to a survivor of extreme abuse, and finally to an outspoken advocate for women's rights. Impact and reception. The book quickly becomes a bestseller, translated into Arabic, and is widely read around the world. It is praised for its raw honesty, emotional depth, and the courage of the women whose stories it tells. The book is used as a tool for advocacy, education, and support for other women facing similar circumstances. Summary table. Testimonies in Susan's book. Name. Country/background. Key experience. Ikram Hafez. Egypt. Severe abuse. Insaf Salah Al-Junaid. Sudan. Oppressive customs. Aisha Abdul Qadir. Somalia. Forced marriage, violence. Shabana Siddiqui. Pakistan. Family and societal struggles. Layla Haddad. Syria. Abuse and survival. Nadia Noor. USA. Conversion, marriage to terrorist, escape. Susan Peterson Irshad. Australia. Central memoir, abuse, activism. In essence, Susan's book is a collective testimony, a blend of her own survival story and those of other women from diverse backgrounds, all united by their courage to speak out and their hope for change. Readers' reactions to Susan Peterson's book, Irshad and the Abuse of Muslim Women, as described in the novel, were dramatic, highly polarized, and global in scope. 1. Widespread impact and bestseller status. The book quickly became a bestseller, translated into Arabic, and was widely read around the world. It was praised for its raw honesty, emotional depth, and the courage of the women whose stories it told. The New York Times Magazine named it a bestseller for the year, and it was read by millions, touching the souls of people worldwide. 2. Support and admiration. Many readers, especially in non-Muslim countries, expressed admiration for Susan's courage and the bravery of the other women who shared their testimonies. The book was seen as a powerful tool for advocacy, education, and support for other women facing similar circumstances. It inspired emotional support and solidarity from both men and women, Muslims and non-Muslims, who wrote to the Association of Abused Muslim Women to express their feelings and support for the female survivors. 3. Controversy and outrage. In Muslim communities, the book sparked outrage and controversy. Many Muslims, especially men, were angered by Susan's explicit criticism of the Quran and Hadiths and her call for reform. Some accused her of lying, fabricating hadiths, or attacking Islam itself. There were protests, accusations of Islamophobia, and even threats against Susan and the association. The book's content was seen by some as blasphemous or as an attack on their faith and identity. 4. Influence on social change. Despite the backlash, the book played a significant role in raising awareness about the abuse of women in certain contexts and inspired other survivors to come forward. It was used as a reference and rallying point for advocacy, public speaking, and the work of the Association of Abused Muslim Women. The testimonies included in the book helped to break the silence around taboo subjects and encouraged open discussion about women's rights and religious reform. 5. Lasting legacy. Even after Susan lost her memory due to an assassination attempt, her book and the testimonies she published continued to speak for her and do an amazing job. Many Muslims, especially women, admitted that after reading her book and hearing her speeches, they understood the realities of abuse and oppression, and some began to question or leave their religion as a result. In summary, Susan's book was met with both acclaim and condemnation. It became a bestseller, inspired and empowered female survivors, sparked controversy and protest, and left a lasting impact on the conversation about women's rights, religious reform, and the realities of abuse in Muslim societies. Impact of Susan Peterson's book on Muslim women. Susan Peterson's book, published after her escape from years of abuse and trauma in Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and as a refugee, became a bestseller and had a significant impact on Muslim women, especially those who had experienced or were experiencing abuse. 1. Empowerment and validation. Many Muslim women, especially those who had suffered abuse, found their own experiences reflected in Susan's testimony and the other stories included in the book. The book gave voice to the pain, fear, and injustice that many had endured in silence. For the first time, some women felt validated and understood, realizing they were not alone in their suffering. The book's raw honesty and detailed accounts of abusive forced marriage, FGM, and legal oppression resonated deeply. 2. Catalyst for speaking out. The book inspired many ex-Muslim women and even some practicing Muslim women to come forward and share their own stories of abuse and oppression. Susan's Association of Abused Muslim Women, which she founded and funded, received hundreds of testimonies from women around the world who had previously been too afraid or ashamed to speak. The association published these testimonies, further amplifying the voices of female survivors and creating a growing network of solidarity and support. 3. Awareness and awakening. The book opened the eyes of many Muslim women to the systemic nature of the abuse they faced. Some readers, especially those in the West, admitted that after reading Susan's book and the testimonies of other women, they understood for the first time that their religion and cultural practices were sources of terror, abuse, and oppression of women. It challenged the narratives promoted by some religious leaders and communities that denied or minimized the existence of abuse. 4. Encouragement to seek change. The stories in the book and Susan's activism encouraged women to seek help, leave abusive situations, or advocate for their rights. Some women joined the Association of Abused Muslim Women, participated in meetings, or sought legal and social support to escape cycles of violence. 5. Controversy and backlash. The book also sparked controversy and backlash from conservative Muslim communities and leaders who accused Susan of lying, fabricating stories, or attacking Islam. Some women who spoke out faced social ostracism or threats, but the growing network of support helped many persevere. 6. Long-term impact. Over time, the book and the association contributed to a slow but growing movement of Muslim women and ex-Muslim women advocating for reform, legal protection, and recognition of their rights. The testimonies published in the book became a resource for activists, educators, and policymakers working to address gender-based violence and religiously justified abuse. In summary, Susan Peterson's book became a beacon for abused Muslim women, empowering them to speak out, seek help, and demand change. It broke the silence around taboo subjects, validated the experiences of countless female survivors, and helped build a global movement for women's rights and protection from religiously justified abuse. The Arabic proverb, "Its end is musk," Arabic, /khatamatuha misk, is used in the novel to symbolize a story or journey that, despite hardship or bitterness along the way, concludes with something beautiful, fragrant, or redemptive. In Arabic culture, musk is a precious and highly valued perfume, often associated with purity, luxury, and a pleasing conclusion. In the context of the novel, "For the Sake of My Children," the proverb is invoked to describe the ultimate outcome of Susan Peterson's, Irshad's, long and harrowing journey. Despite years of suffering, abuse, loss, and trauma, her story ends with hope, healing, and a sense of purpose. After regaining her memory and overcoming immense adversity, Susan is able to rebuild her life, reunite with her family, and use her experiences to help others. She founds the Association of Abused Muslim Women, writes a best-selling book, and becomes a voice for the voiceless. The use of "its end is musk" emphasizes that, although the path was filled with pain and darkness, the conclusion is one of redemption, meaning, and positive impact. Her suffering is transformed into a legacy of advocacy and hope for others. Direct reference from the novel. As the famous Arab proverb says, "Its end is musk." Therefore, the best way to conclude Irshad's novel is that we must mention her second love life, which began with her Good Samaritan lover, her American guard, in the notorious Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. Summary. The proverb is used to highlight that, no matter how bitter or tragic the journey, the final outcome can be sweet, meaningful, and fragrant like musk. It is a metaphor for hope, resilience, and the possibility of a beautiful ending after great suffering. Musk as a symbol of hope. In the context of the novel, "For the Sake of My Children," musk is used as a metaphor for hope, especially in the Arabic proverb, "Its end is musk." Here's how musk comes to symbolize hope. 1. Cultural significance of musk. In Arabic and Islamic culture, musk is a rare, precious, and highly valued perfume. It is associated with purity, beauty, and a pleasing, lingering fragrance. Musk is often used in classical Arabic poetry and proverbs to represent something that leaves a lasting, positive impression, something beautiful that remains after hardship or struggle. 2. Transformation after hardship. The proverb, "Its end is musk," is used to describe a journey or story that, despite being filled with pain, bitterness, or difficulty, concludes with something sweet, redemptive, or hopeful. In the novel, Susan Peterson's life is marked by immense suffering, loss, and trauma. Yet, after enduring these hardships, her story ends with healing, reconciliation, and a new sense of purpose. This positive transformation is likened to the fragrance of musk that lingers after all the bitterness has passed. 3. Musk as a metaphor for hope. Musk, as a symbol, suggests that no matter how dark or painful the journey is, there is the possibility of a beautiful and hopeful ending. It embodies the idea that hope can emerge from suffering and that the final outcome can be sweet and meaningful, even if the path was bitter. In the novel, Susan's eventual recovery, her activism, and her ability to help others are the musk at the end of her long ordeal, a sign that hope and goodness can prevail. 4. Direct reference from the novel. As the famous Arab proverb says, its end is musk. Therefore, the best way to conclude Irshad's novel is that we must mention her second love life, which began with her Good Samaritan lover, her American guard, in the notorious Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. Summary: Musk symbolizes hope in the novel by representing the possibility of a beautiful, redemptive, and meaningful ending after a journey of hardship. It is a metaphor for the enduring fragrance of hope that remains, even after the most bitter experiences. Summary of Irshad's second love life and its role in the novel's conclusion. Context and background. After enduring years of unimaginable suffering, abuse, deceptive marriage, religious oppression, loss of her children, imprisonment, and near-death experiences, Irshad, formerly Susan Peterson, finds herself detained in Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, as a suspected Muslim female terrorist due to her association with her late husband, a 9/11 hijacker, and her years spent among the Taliban and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. In Gitmo, she is isolated, traumatized, and spiritually adrift, having lost faith in both herself and the systems around her. The Good Samaritan Guard. During her time in solitary confinement, Irshad develops a unique and transformative relationship with one of her American guards. This guard, whom she refers to as her Good Samaritan, is compassionate and supportive, standing in stark contrast to the cruelty and suspicion she has faced from others. He secretly provides her with a copy of the Gideon Bible after her request for one is initially mocked and denied by another female guard. This act of kindness becomes a turning point for Irshad, reigniting her spiritual journey and helping her reconnect with her Christian faith. Spiritual and emotional rebirth. Reading the Bible in her cell, Irshad finds comfort, hope, and a sense of forgiveness that she had long been denied. The teachings of Jesus, especially the commandment to love your enemies, resonate deeply with her, offering a message of peace and redemption that stands in stark contrast to the violence and hatred she witnessed in the name of religion. This spiritual awakening leads her to openly embrace Christianity once again, literally tearing up her Quran and reclaiming her original identity as Susan Peterson. The love story. The relationship between Irshad and her American guard evolves from mutual respect and compassion into a deep emotional attachment and love. The guard, described as her confidant and Good Samaritan, becomes a source of strength and hope during her darkest days. Their bond is characterized by emotional intimacy, shared faith, and a sense of solidarity against the injustices they both witness. After her release from Gitmo, Irshad and her American guard, whose name is later revealed as Samuel Wilson, maintain contact, and their relationship culminates in marriage after she regains her memory following an assassination attempt that leaves her with amnesia. Symbolic and narrative significance. Redemption and healing. The love story with her Good Samaritan guard represents Irshad's journey from victimhood to healing. It is through this relationship that she finds the courage to reclaim her life, forgive herself, and move forward. Contrast with first marriage. Her second marriage to Samuel is depicted as the antithesis of her first marriage to Mustafa. While Mustafa's love led her into a world of oppression and suffering, Samuel's love is nurturing, respectful, and liberating. The novel explicitly contrasts the darkness of her life with Mustafa in Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia with the light and freedom she experiences with Samuel in the United States. Closure and new beginning. By concluding the novel with this second love, the author emphasizes that, even after the most profound trauma, it is possible to find hope, love, and a new sense of purpose. Irshad's story comes full circle, from a young woman seeking love and meaning through a crucible of suffering to a survivor who finds both in a new, healthy relationship. Final message. The novel's conclusion, centered on Irshad's second love life, serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It underscores the possibility of redemption, the transformative power of love and faith, and the importance of reclaiming one's voice and agency after being silenced by cruelty and injustice. The relationship with her Good Samaritan guard is not just a romantic subplot, it is the narrative's ultimate symbol of hope, healing, and the enduring possibility of happiness after tragedy. In summary, the best way to conclude Irshad's novel is by highlighting her second love life with her American guard, which begins in the darkness of Guantanamo Bay and blossoms into a relationship that restores her faith, identity, and hope. This love story is the novel's final affirmation that, even after the worst suffering, new beginnings and true love are possible. Here is a detailed, side-by-side comparison of Irshad's two love lives as depicted in the novel For the Sake of My Children. 1. First love life, Mustafa, Saudi husband. Origin and nature. How they met, Susan, later Irshad, meets Mustafa, a Saudi student in Australia. She is drawn to his politeness, religious devotion, and the allure of a different culture. Their relationship begins with idealism and romance. Conversion and sacrifice. Susan converts to Islam, changes her name to Irshad, and adopts strict religious practices to marry Mustafa, despite her family's objections. She sacrifices her family, faith, and autonomy for love. Dynamics and development. Control and isolation. After marriage and moving to Saudi Arabia, Mustafa becomes increasingly controlling, enforcing strict religious rules, isolating Irshad from her family, and demanding total obedience. Irshad is forced to adopt conservative dress, abandon her previous lifestyle, and submit to Mustafa's authority in all aspects of life. Abuse and oppression. The relationship is marked by emotional and physical abuse, polygamy, forced isolation, and religious justification for violence. Mustafa uses religious texts to silence Irshad's objections to practices like FGM, child marriage, and polygamy. Loss of self. Irshad's autonomy and identity are gradually stripped away. She endures suffering for the sake of her children, rationalizing her pain as a result of misinterpretation rather than the religion itself, until the abuse becomes undeniable. Outcome. Descent into extremism. Mustafa's radicalization leads the family to Afghanistan, where Irshad's suffering intensifies. She is trapped in a world of religious extremism, war, and further abuse. Separation and trauma. The marriage ends in violence, divorce, and Irshad's eventual imprisonment and separation from her children. Mustafa dies as a terrorist, leaving Irshad to face the consequences alone. 2. Second love life. The Good Samaritan, American guard at Guantanamo Bay. Origin and nature. How they met. Irshad meets her Good Samaritan while imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay. He is an American guard who shows her kindness and compassion in a place defined by suspicion and trauma. Spiritual rebirth. The guard secretly gives Irshad a Bible, which becomes the catalyst for her spiritual awakening and return to Christianity. Their bond is rooted in empathy, shared faith, and mutual respect. Dynamics and development. Healing and support. Unlike her first marriage, this relationship is nurturing and supportive. The guard helps Irshad heal from her trauma, encouraging her to reclaim her identity and faith. Their connection grows from friendship and spiritual solidarity to deep emotional attachment and love. Equality and freedom. The relationship is characterized by equality, respect, and the absence of coercion. Irshad is free to be herself, to question, and to grow. The love she experiences is restorative, not destructive. Outcome. New beginning. After her release and recovery from an assassination attempt, Irshad, now Susan again, and her American guard, Samuel Wilson, marry. Their union symbolizes hope, redemption, and the possibility of happiness after profound suffering. Contrast to first marriage. The novel explicitly contrasts the darkness and oppression of her first Islamic marriage with the light, freedom, and dignity of her second Christian matrimonial union. Her life with Samuel is depicted as the fulfillment of the love and respect she was denied for so long. Side-by-side comparison table. Aspect. First love, Mustafa, Saudi husband. Second love, Good Samaritan, American Guard. Origin. Romantic idealism, cross-cultural allure. Compassion in captivity, spiritual solidarity. Conversion. Susan converts to Islam, loses autonomy. Irshad returns to Christianity, regains self. Relationship. Controlling, abusive, patriarchal. Nurturing, healing, based on equality. Faith. Used as a tool of oppression. Source of healing and empowerment. Outcome. Trauma, loss, separation, radicalization. Redemption, new beginning, mutual support. Symbolism. Descent into darkness and loss of self. Restoration, hope, and the power of true love. Narrative and thematic significance. First love represents the dangers of blind idealism, the loss of self in the pursuit of love, and the destructive power of patriarchal and religious extremism. Second love embodies healing, the reclaiming of agency, and the transformative power of compassion and faith. It is the novel's affirmation that hope and love can be found even after the deepest suffering. In summary, Irshad's first love life is a journey from hope to oppression, marked by loss of autonomy, abuse, and trauma. Her second love life is a journey from trauma to healing, marked by compassion, equality, and spiritual rebirth. The novel uses these two relationships to illustrate the contrast between destructive and redemptive love, and to show that, even after the worst suffering, new beginnings are possible. How the two marriages reflect her growth. First marriage, Mustafa. Naivete and sacrifice. Irshad's first marriage is marked by youthful idealism, blind love, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for her partner. She is manipulated into abandoning her identity, faith, and family, believing that love and religious devotion will bring fulfillment. Loss and trauma. The marriage exposes her to the harsh realities of religious extremism, gender oppression, and violence. Irshad's suffering deepens her empathy for others, but also leads to profound trauma and loss of agency. Second marriage, Samuel. Healing and self-discovery. Through her relationship with Samuel, Susan learns to value herself, set boundaries, and seek relationships based on mutual respect and love. Her spiritual rebirth and emotional healing are central to this transformation. Empowerment and advocacy. The second marriage is not just a personal victory, but a symbol of her growth into a survivor and advocate. Susan uses her experiences to help others, founds an association for abused women, and becomes a voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Summary table. Aspect. First marriage, Mustafa. Second marriage, Samuel. Foundation. Blind love, conversion, sacrifice. Compassion, healing, faith. Dynamics. Control, abuse, trauma. Equality, support, partnership. Outcome. Loss, suffering, disempowerment. Recovery, advocacy, empowerment. Reflection of growth. Naivete, disillusionment. Healing, self-actualization. In essence, Irshad/Susan's two marriages serve as bookends to her journey. The first is a descent into oppression and loss, while the second is a climb toward healing, self-respect, and advocacy. Her growth is reflected in her ability to move from victimhood to survivor, from silence to voice, and from isolation to community leadership. Irshad's, Susan Peterson's, faith journey is one of the most profound arcs in the novel, For the Sake of My Children. Her faith evolves dramatically through the novel, reflecting her personal growth, trauma, and eventual healing. Here's a detailed analysis of how her faith changes over time. 1. Christian upbringing and early doubt. Childhood. Susan is raised in a loving, devout Christian family in Sydney, Australia. Her early life is shaped by Christian values, church attendance, and a strong sense of faith and belonging. Curiosity and openness. As a young adult, Susan is intellectually curious and open to other cultures and religions, which sets the stage for her later spiritual journey. 2. Conversion to Islam. faith as sacrifice and identity. Conversion for love. Susan's conversion to Islam is motivated by her love for Mustafa and her desire to belong to his world. She adopts the name Irshad, changes her dress and habits, and tries to embrace her new faith sincerely. Early zeal and submission. At first, Irshad is earnest in her religious practice, learning Islamic prayers, attending women's gatherings, and striving to be the ideal Muslim wife. Her faith is shaped by external expectations and the need for acceptance, rather than deep personal conviction. 3. Crisis and disillusionment. Faith as survival. Religious justification for abuse. As Irshad faces increasing abuse, isolation, and trauma, she is repeatedly told that her suffering is justified by religious texts. She tries to rationalize her pain by believing that the problem lies in interpretation, not in Islam itself. Suppression of doubt. Irshad suppresses her doubts and endures, convincing herself that faith requires obedience and sacrifice. Her faith becomes a tool for survival, helping her endure unimaginable hardship for the sake of her children. 4. Spiritual crisis and awakening. Questioning and rebellion. After witnessing and experiencing abuses justified by religious texts such as FGM, child marriage, polygamy, and violence, Irshad's faith is shaken. She begins to question the very foundations of the beliefs she adopted, leading to a profound spiritual crisis. Critical reflection. This crisis prompts her to reflect on her choices, the teachings she followed, and the systems that perpetuated her suffering. Her faith, once a source of endurance, becomes a catalyst for questioning and, ultimately, transformation. 5. Return to Christianity. Faith as healing and empowerment. Spiritual rebirth in prison. While imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay, Irshad requests a Bible and begins to read it. The teachings of Jesus, especially about love, forgiveness, and peace, bring her comfort and a sense of hope she had lost. Conversion and advocacy. Her renewed Christian faith leads her to pray for her children to be raised as Christians, believing this will give them a better future and protect them from the cycles of abuse and extremism she experienced. She openly rejects Islam, attends church, and finds peace and purpose in her new faith. Faith as empowerment. Christianity becomes a source of strength, healing, and advocacy. Irshad uses her story and her voice to help other women, expose injustice, and fight for the rights of the oppressed. 6. Summary table. Stages of faith evolution. Stage: faith state and struggle. Growth/outcome. Christian upbringing. Loving, open, curious. Seeks understanding, values faith. Conversion to Islam. Motivated by love, not conviction, identity crisis. Loss of self, internal conflict. Crisis and disillusionment. Faith used to justify abuse, doubts suppressed. Spiritual despair, crisis of belief. Spiritual awakening. Begins to question imposed faith, seeks deeper meaning. Awakening, critical reflection. Return to Christianity. Reclaims original faith, finds healing and empowerment. Spiritual growth, advocacy for others. 7. Key quotes illustrating her faith evolution. On conversion and sacrifice, once again, she is carried away by her blind love and agrees to change her name to Irshad. Of course, her Arab lover chose this Muslim name. Irshad means dedication to learning the teachings of Islam. It also means religious guidance for the sake of God and His Messenger. On crisis and doubt, she has always convinced herself that the unbeatable problem is not in the Quran and the hadiths of the Prophet, but rather in the interpretations of those divine texts. The Australian wife believes that if these sacred texts are subject to better reading and understanding, then the Islamic society will be a perfect society. On spiritual awakening, she read the Sermon on the Mount repeatedly until she had a lot of it stored in her heart. She loved the commandment of the Lord Jesus, in which He told His disciples, "Love your enemies." She lived for many years with people whose prophet said that God commanded him to kill his enemies and fight those who rejected His religious message, but the Lord Jesus commanded His followers to love their enemies and pray for them. On advocacy and empowerment, Susan Peterson concluded that God had called her to expose the evils of Islam and fight for the rights of Muslim women. Therefore, once she became aware of her past life, she decided to pioneer an association of ex-Muslim women who had gone through the same abusive and oppressive lives and have something to share with the outside world. In essence, Susan's faith evolves from a foundation of Christian love and curiosity through a period of sacrificial conversion and submission, into a crisis of doubt and disillusionment, and finally to a spiritual rebirth in Christianity that empowers her to heal, advocate, and lead. Her journey is not just a religious transformation, but a profound process of reclaiming her identity, agency, and voice. Irshad's, Susan Peterson's, spiritual journey is deeply shaped by her exposure to different scriptures at various stages of her life. The novel provides a nuanced look at which religious texts inspire, comfort, or challenge her, and how these scriptures influence her evolving faith and identity. 1. Christian Scriptures, the Holy Bible. Early life. Childhood. Susan is raised in a devout Christian family, attending church and Sunday school. The Bible, especially the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, forms the foundation of her early moral and spiritual worldview. Spiritual rebirth in Guantanamo Bay. Key inspiration. While imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay, Irshad requests a copy of the Bible. The guard secretly brings her a Gideon Bible, which becomes central to her spiritual transformation. Sermon on the Mount. She is especially moved by Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, particularly the commandment to love your enemies. This message of forgiveness, love, and peace stands in stark contrast to the violence and hatred she witnessed being justified by other religious texts. Personal prayer. The Bible inspires her to pray for her children to be raised as Christians, and she finds comfort and psychological healing in the teachings of Jesus. She prays, "O Lord, I know that I am not worthy even to speak your most holy and precious name with my unclean and filthy lips. I have turned my back on you and followed a religion that taught its followers nothing but hatred and killing of infidels, misogyny, abuse, and violence towards women. Today, I come before you on bent knees and with a penitent heart, and I make one request. I want you to entrust the care of my 6 children into the hands of those who follow you from their hearts to bring them up as Christians. Amen." 2. Islamic Scriptures, Quran and Hadith. Conversion and early marriage. Quran. When Susan converts to Islam to marry Mustafa, she is taught to recite and memorize verses from the Quran. Early on, she is inspired by the verses that speak of peace, tolerance, and the unity of Abrahamic faiths. Mustafa selectively shares verses that present Islam as a religion of peace and respect for Christians and Jews. Hadith. She is also taught to follow the hadiths, sayings, and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, which are presented to her as sources of wisdom and guidance for daily life. Disillusionment and crisis. Scriptures used to justify abuse. As Irshad's marriage becomes abusive, she is confronted with Quranic verses and hadiths that are used to justify polygamy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, wife beating, and the subjugation of women. For example, Quran, Surah An-Nisa 4, verse 34, used to justify a husband's right to beat his wife. Hadiths on FGM and child marriage used to justify the circumcision of her daughters and the marriage of underage girls, referencing the Prophet's marriage to Aisha and sayings about female circumcision. Conflict. These scriptures, once a source of inspiration, become a source of pain and doubt as Irshad witnesses their use to legitimize violence and oppression. 3. Scriptures that mark her turning point. Bible, New Testament. The teachings of Jesus, especially about loving one's enemies and forgiveness, inspire Irshad to reclaim her Christian faith and find healing. The Sermon on the Mount and the message of grace and redemption become her spiritual anchor. Quran and Hadiths. As critique. In her later activism, Irshad explicitly critiques the Quran and Hadiths, arguing that they are the root of the abuses she and other women suffered. She calls for these texts to be exposed and banned in the West, believing that their literal interpretation perpetuates terrorism and misogyny. 4. Summary table. Scriptures and their influence on Irshad. Stage of life. Scriptures inspiring her. Effect on faith/actions. Childhood. Bible, Gospels, Jesus' teachings. Foundation of morality, hope, and belonging. Conversion to Islam. Quran, peaceful verses. Motivation for sacrifice, identity, belonging. Crisis/disillusion. Quran, legalistic verses, hadiths. Source of pain, doubt, and spiritual crisis. Spiritual rebirth. Bible, Sermon on the Mount, Gospels. Healing, forgiveness, empowerment, advocacy. Activism. Bible, justice, compassion. Calls for reform, exposes abuse in Islamic texts. Quran/hadiths as critique. Quran/hadiths as critique. 5. Direct quotes from the novel. On the Bible's inspiration, she read the Sermon on the Mount repeatedly until she had a lot of it stored in her heart. She loved the commandment of the Lord Jesus, in which he told his disciples, "Love your enemies." She lived for many years with people whose prophet said that God commanded him to kill his enemies and fight those who rejected his religious message, but the Lord Jesus commanded his followers to love their enemies and pray for them. On the Quran and Hadith as justification for abuse, men are the maintainers of women because God has made some of them superior to others and because they spend of their wealth. To the unseen, as God has preserved. And those from whom you fear disobedience, admonish them, and leave them in the beds and beat them. Surah An-Nisa 4, verse 34. On her prayer for her children, O Lord, I know that I am not worthy even to speak your most holy and precious name with my unclean and filthy lips. I have turned my back on you and followed a religion that taught its followers nothing but hatred and killing of infidels, misogyny, abuse, and violence towards women. Today, I come before you on bent knees and with a penitent heart, and I make one request. I want you to entrust the care of my 6 children into the hands of those who follow you from their hearts to bring them up as Christians. Amen. In summary, the Bible, especially the Gospels and the Sermon on the Mount, inspires Irshad's compassion, forgiveness, and eventual healing. The Quran and Hadith initially inspire her conversion and sense of belonging, but later become sources of pain and disillusionment as they are used to justify abuse. Her journey through these scriptures reflects her evolving faith, from hope and sacrifice, through crisis and doubt, to healing, advocacy, and a return to her spiritual roots. Muslim husband Mustafa versus Christian husband Samuel. Here's a detailed comparison of the personalities of Irshad's, Susan's 2 husbands as depicted in the novel. 1. Mustafa al-Shamari, Muslim husband. Core personality traits. Zealous and rigid, Mustafa is deeply religious, with a strict, literalist interpretation of Islam. He is zealous about religious practice and increasingly radicalized, eventually joining jihadist groups and moving his family into war zones. Controlling and authoritarian, he isolates Irshad from her family and friends, enforces strict religious rules, and demands total obedience. He uses religious texts to justify his dominance and expects his wife to submit in all matters. Abusive, Mustafa engages in emotional, physical, and sometimes sexual abuse. He justifies domestic violence, polygamy, and even child marriage through religious doctrine. He is quick to anger and uses violence to enforce his will. Manipulative, he selectively presents religious teachings to justify his actions, often hiding the more violent or misogynistic aspects of his faith from Susan until after marriage. Emotionally immature, the novel describes him as suffering from an inferiority complex, jealousy, and childishness. He is emotionally volatile, especially when his authority is questioned. Tragic. Ultimately, his fanaticism leads to his own destruction. He dies as a terrorist, leaving his family in peril. 2. Sam Wilson, Christian husband, the Good Samaritan guard. Core personality traits. Compassionate and gentle, Sam is first introduced as a guard at Guantanamo Bay who shows Irshad kindness and empathy. He brings her a Bible, supports her spiritual healing, and treats her with respect and dignity. Supportive and patient, he is patient with Ershad's trauma and recovery, supporting her through her spiritual rebirth and amnesia. He encourages her to reclaim her identity and faith, and stands by her as she rebuilds her life. Respectful and egalitarian, their relationship is built on equality and mutual respect. Sam never tries to control or dominate Ershad. Instead, he empowers her to make her own choices and supports her advocacy work. Emotionally mature, Sam is emotionally stable, understanding, and able to provide comfort and security. He is not threatened by Ershad's independence or activism, but rather encourages her growth. Redemptive and healing, his love is portrayed as redemptive, helping Ershad heal from years of trauma and abuse. He is a source of hope and new beginnings, contrasting sharply with the destructive influence of her first husband. Summary table. Personality comparison. Trait/aspect. Mustafa, Muslim husband. Sam, Christian husband, Good Samaritan. Religious outlook. Zealous, rigid, literalist, extremist. Christian, compassionate, open-hearted. Control. Authoritarian, manipulative, abusive. Supportive, empowering, non-controlling. Emotional maturity. Immature, jealous, volatile. Mature, patient, emotionally stable. Relationship style. Dominance, submission, violence. Equality, respect, healing. Response to conflict. Anger, violence, religious justification. Patience, dialogue, empathy. Impact on Ershad. Trauma, loss of self, oppression. Healing, growth, restoration. Key insights. Mustafa represents the dangers of unchecked patriarchal and religious authority. His personality is shaped by fanaticism, insecurity, and a need for control, which manifests in abuse and manipulation. He is unable to adapt or empathize, and his rigidity ultimately destroys his family and himself. Sam embodies the qualities of compassion, patience, and respect. He is a healer and a partner, not a master. His love is transformative, helping Ershad reclaim her identity, faith, and agency. He supports her activism and personal growth, providing a foundation for a healthy, loving relationship. In summary, Mustafa's personality is defined by zealotry, control, and abuse, while Sam's is defined by empathy, support, and healing. The contrast between the two men mirrors Ershad's journey from oppression and trauma to freedom and self-empowerment. Where does her Muslim husband take her after their halal Islamic marriage, and where does her Christian husband take her after their holy matrimonial union? Muslim husband, Mustafa. After marriage, Mustafa takes Susan, Ershad, from Australia to Saudi Arabia, where she is subjected to strict religious laws, isolation, and abuse. Later, he moves the family to Afghanistan, plunging them into the heart of Taliban and al-Qaeda territory, where life becomes a daily struggle for survival amid war, deprivation, and oppression. Christian husband, Sam, the American Guard. After marriage, after her release and recovery, Susan marries her American Good Samaritan in a Christian ceremony in Sydney. He then takes her to New York City, USA, a symbol of freedom, opportunity, and the promise of a new life. Here, Susan finds peace, love, and the ability to continue her advocacy work in a supportive environment. The contrast is stark, from the worst and most dangerous country in the world, Afghanistan, with her first husband, to the greatest and most beautiful country in the world, America, with her second husband. Summary table. Key contrasts. Aspect. First marriage, Mustafa. Second marriage, Sam, American Guard. Origin. Passion, conversion, idealism. Compassion, healing, shared faith. Dynamics. Control, abuse, religious extremism. Equality, support, mutual respect. Faith. Islam, initially sincere, later doubted. Christianity, rebirth, inspiration. Scriptures. Quran, Hadith, often weaponized. Bible, Sermon on the Mount, the Gospel of Luke, love your enemies. Romans, chapter 8, verse 28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Where he takes her. Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, oppression. Sydney, New York, freedom, advocacy. Growth. Loss, survival, awakening. Healing, empowerment, advocacy. The novel draws a powerful symbolic comparison between the Statue of Liberty in New York City and the Black Stone in Mecca City to highlight the contrasting status of women in Western and Islamic societies. Statue of Liberty, in New York City, symbol of women's freedom and dignity. Representation. The Statue of Liberty is described as a monumental symbol of freedom, democracy, and the equal rights of women. It is a female figure holding a torch, representing enlightenment, hope, and the promise of liberty for all, regardless of gender. Message. In the novel, when Susan, Ershad, marries her Christian husband Sam, the Good Samaritan guard, he takes her to New York City, where she is struck by the symbolism of the Statue of Liberty. The statue is seen as a celebration of womanhood, independence, and the right of women to participate fully in society. It stands as a beacon of hope for those seeking refuge from oppression, and as a reminder that women can be leaders, icons, and symbols of national pride. Black Stone, in Mecca City, symbol of women's subjugation and sexual objectification. Representation. The Black Stone, set in the Kaaba in Mecca, is a central object of veneration in the Islamic pilgrimage, Hajj. The novel presents a critical view, describing the Black Stone as a symbol of the sexual objectification and ritual subjugation of women in Islamic societies. Message. When Susan marries Mustafa, her Muslim husband, he takes her to Saudi Arabia and then to Mecca for Hajj. The novel describes the rituals around the Black Stone as rooted in ancient pagan practices, including the worship of female genitalia, and criticizes the way women are treated during the pilgrimage, subjected to harassment, forced to cover themselves, and denied autonomy. The Black Stone is depicted as a symbol of a system that reduces women to objects for male pleasure and control, and enforces their invisibility and silence. Direct contrast in the novel. After her first marriage, Susan is taken to Mecca, where she experiences the harsh realities of gender segregation, sexual harassment, and the expectation that women remain hidden and submissive. The Black Stone is associated with rituals that, in the novel's view, reinforce women's inferior status and the normalization of their suffering. After her second marriage, Susan is taken to New York, where the Statue of Liberty stands as a proud, unveiled woman, holding a torch high. The novel explicitly contrasts this with the Black Stone, suggesting that in America, the female form is celebrated as a symbol of freedom and hope, while in Mecca, the female body is hidden, controlled, and symbolically worshipped only as an object of male desire or religious ritual. Quotations and analysis. The novel states, her abusive, controlling, and tyrannical first husband took her to the worst and most dangerous country in the world, Afghanistan, where she and her children were exposed to the most terrible types of injustice, persecution, and torment, while her loving and kind second husband, who is according to her the Good Samaritan, brought her to the greatest and most beautiful country in the world, America, which is the promised land and is the dream of every human being and every refugee in the world. On their first visit outside of Australia, her Muslim husband Mustafa forced her to travel with him to his motherland, where they visited the Black House in the city of Mecca, which is called the Sacred House of God, where they circumambulated around it and the Black Stone, which was carved in the form of a woman's pussy, which symbolized the humiliation of the human female sexually, subduing her and violating the sanctity of her body before the Muslim man who gave him Islam the right, possessing her as a wife, a slave girl, beating her, abusing her, and raping her at any time he wants to fuck her pussy, and in any natural sexual way or anomalous practice, such as sodomizing her in the ass against her desire. Their first visit outside of Australia after marriage, she was taken by her Christian husband Sam to his homeland, the United States of America, which represents the pinnacle and greatness of Western civilization that was built on the Judeo-Christian heritage, where there is the White House, which symbolizes true democracy and equal rights for women with their male counterparts, and where there is the Statue of Liberty made on the shape of the body of a free, courageous woman carrying in her hand the flame of freedom and independence from the control and tyranny of men. Summary table. Symbolic comparison. Symbol. Location. Represents in the novel. Message about women's status. Black stone. Mecca. Sexual objectification, ritual subjugation. Women as objects hidden, controlled. Statue of Liberty. New York City. Freedom, dignity, equality. Women as icons of liberty and empowerment. Conclusion. The novel uses the contrast between the Black Stone and the Statue of Liberty as a powerful metaphor for the status of women. In Mecca, the Black Stone is associated with ancient rituals that, in the novel's critique, perpetuate the subjugation and sexual objectification of women. In New York, the Statue of Liberty stands as a proud, unveiled woman, an emblem of freedom, equality, and the celebration of women's dignity. This comparison encapsulates the protagonist's journey from oppression and invisibility to freedom and self-empowerment, and serves as a broader commentary on the possibilities for women's liberation in different cultural and religious contexts. Conclusion. In the end, For the Sake of My Children is not merely the chronicle of one woman's harrowing odyssey across continents and cultures. It is a universal testament to the indomitable power of a mother's love, the cost of silence, and the courage it takes to reclaim one's voice after being silenced by cruelty. Susan Peterson's journey from the warmth of her Australian home through the suffocating darkness of religious extremism, violence, and war, and finally to the light of freedom and self-rediscovery, embodies the struggle of countless women whose stories remain unheard. Her transformation from Susan to Ershad and back again is not just a change of name, but a crucible in which her identity, faith, and spirit are tested, broken, and ultimately reforged. Through every loss, every betrayal, and every act of courage, Susan discovers that hope is not a luxury, but a necessity, a light that refuses to be extinguished, even in the darkest of places. Her suffering is not in vain. It becomes the seed of her activism, the foundation of her advocacy, and the beacon that guides others out of despair. The novel's final message is clear. The fight for dignity, justice, and the rights of women and children is not the burden of one, but the responsibility of all. As Susan rises from the ashes of her past, she calls on each of us to bear witness, to care, and to act. Her voice, once silenced by fear, now rings out as a rallying cry for change, echoing the words of Malala Yousafzai, "When the whole world is silent, even one voice becomes powerful." Let this story be more than a tale of survival. Let it be a call to empathy, to courage, and to action. For the sake of our children, and for the hope of a more just and compassionate world, may we never turn away from the suffering of others, but instead let their stories move us to compassion and to change. A letter from Ershad/Susan to the reader. Dear reader, if you are holding my story in your hands, you are holding the weight of 1,000 silent voices, mine, my children's, and the countless women whose suffering is hidden behind closed doors and beneath veils of silence. I was once Susan Peterson, a daughter of Sydney, a dreamer, a believer in love's power to bridge worlds. I became Ershad Al-Shamari, a wife, a mother, a convert, a prisoner of hope and of fear. My journey took me from the warmth of my family's embrace to the cold, suffocating darkness of oppression, violence, and loss. I have been called many things: lover, apostate, traitor, survivor. But above all, I am a mother. Every choice I made, every sacrifice, every desperate act was for the sake of my children. I write to you not as a victim, but as a witness. I have seen the faces of cruelty and fanaticism, and I have felt the crushing weight of despair. I have been beaten, silenced, and stripped of my dignity. I have watched my children suffer, and I have tasted the bitterness of losing them to systems and beliefs that value obedience over love and silence over truth. But I have also seen the power of resilience. I have learned that hope is not a luxury, it is a necessity. It is the light that refuses to be extinguished, even in the darkest of places. I have learned that the human spirit, especially a mother's love, can endure and rise, even when all seems lost. If my story moves you, let it move you to action. Let it remind you that injustice thrives in silence, and that change begins when we refuse to look away. Stand with those who cannot stand alone. Speak for those who have been silenced. Believe, as I do, that even one voice, yours, can be powerful enough to break the chains of oppression. I have been changed by what happened to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it. My suffering, my survival, and my voice now belong to every Muslim woman and child still waiting for rescue, for justice, for hope. May you never turn away from the suffering of others. May you let your heart be moved, and may you be the voice that breaks the silence. With all my hope. Susan Peterson. A letter from Irshad/Susan to Aisha. My beloved Aisha. There are no words deep enough to hold the sorrow and love I feel as I write to you. For years, I have carried the weight of your absence, a wound that never healed, a longing that never faded. I have replayed every moment, every choice, every desperate prayer that led us to the lives we endured. I have wept for the childhood stolen from you, for the innocence that was never protected, for the pain you bore in silence. If I could gather all the tears I have shed for you, they would fill the oceans. If I could take your suffering and make it my own, I would do so 1,000 times over. I am sorry for every day you felt alone, for every night you cried and I was not there to hold you. I am sorry for the lies you were told about me, for the years you believed I had abandoned you. The truth is, my love for you was the only thing that kept me alive. You are not what was done to you. You are not the scars left by others. You are my daughter, brave, beautiful, and unbreakable. I see your strength in every step you take toward healing. I see your courage in the way you love your own children, in the way you refuse to let the darkness define you. I wish I could give you back the years we lost. I wish I could erase the pain. But I promise you this, I will spend the rest of my life loving you, fighting for you, and standing by your side. You are not alone. You never were. May you find peace, my precious Aisha. May you know, in the deepest part of your heart, that you are cherished beyond measure. With all my love, your mother, Susan Irshad. Reply letter from Aisha to Irshad/Susan. Dearest Mama, your letter reached me like a gentle rain after a long, parched drought. For so many years, I lived in the shadow of pain and confusion, believing I had been forgotten, believing I was unworthy of love. The lies I was told about you became the bars of my prison, but your words have broken them. I have cried for you, too. I have missed you every day. I have longed for your arms around me, for your voice to tell me that I am safe, that I am loved. Even when I was told you had left me, some part of me refused to believe it. Some part of me held on to the memory of your love. I am learning now that healing is not forgetting, but remembering with compassion. I am learning that I am more than what was done to me. I am your daughter, and I carry your strength inside me. I see it in my children's eyes, in the way I refuse to give up, in the hope that it still lives in my heart. Thank you for never giving up on me. Thank you for coming back for me, for fighting for me, for loving me even when I could not love myself. I forgive you, Mama. I forgive the world that tried to break us. I am proud to be your daughter. Let us walk forward together, hand in hand, into a future where our story is not one of loss, but of survival, of love, and of hope. With all my heart, Aisha. A letter of gratitude from Irshad/Susan to the author, written in the voice of a survivor who recognizes the power of having her story told. Dear Dr. Ahmed, there are moments in life when words feel too small for the weight of what we carry. Yet today, I find myself reaching for them, compelled by a gratitude that runs deeper than the scars I bear. Thank you for giving voice to my journey, my pain, my hope, my failures, and my fight. For years, I believed my suffering would be buried in silence, that the world would never know the truth of what women like me endure. You have shattered that silence. You have taken my story, with all its darkness and all its fragile light, and offered it to the world not as a spectacle, but as a call to conscience. Through your words, I am no longer invisible. My children's cries, my daughter's stolen childhood, my own desperate prayers, they are no longer lost in the void. You have honored my love, my mistakes, and my resilience. You have made my wounds matter. I know that telling stories like mine is not easy. It invites anger, denial, and sometimes danger. But you have chosen to stand with the voiceless, to risk misunderstanding for the sake of truth. For that, I am forever grateful. May this book be a lantern in the darkness for others. May it move hearts to compassion and hands to action. May it remind every mother, every daughter, every survivor, you are not alone and your story matters. With all my heart, Irshad, Susan Peterson. For the sake of my children.